4 seconds. That was all the time 3 armed men had left in this world, and not one of them knew it. The wind came down off the mountains before the riders did. It moved through the dry grass first, combed it flat, pushed it east toward the split-rail fence, and the small adobe house sitting alone against the hill like it was trying to warn the place before they ever crested the ridge. In the yard, a woman went on hanging wash. One peg, then the next, hands even, unhurried. She never turned her head, but her eyes had already finished counting. 3 rifles across 3 saddles, 40 feet to the door. The sun behind her good, at her back in their eyes. They laughed. Not loud, just enough. Because the mistake was never the guns, never the dust. The mistake was thinking quiet meant weak. The lead rider swung down, reached for her, and her right hand, instead of finding the next shirt, closed around the walnut grip hanging beneath the basket's rim. Arizona Territory, 1888. The wind came down off the Pinaleños before the riders did. It moved through the dry grass first, combed it flat, pushed it east toward the split-rail fence and the small adobe house sitting alone against the hill, like it was trying to warn the place before the men on horseback ever crested the ridge. 3 of them, dust rising behind their horses in a long gray ribbon, thin at first, then thick, then the trail they'd come from. They rode loose in the saddle, careless, the kind of careless that only comes from men who have already decided how the day is going to end. The lead rider spat into the dirt and grinned at the house below. "Told you," he said. "Ain't even a dog." "Widow woman," the second one said. "Apache widow. Ain't gonna be no trouble." Coburn's boys hit the Hale place. "Took 20 minutes, the third one muttered, checking the loads in his revolver without looking down, the way men do when their hands already know the motion better than their eyes do. "This'll take 5. They laughed. Not loud, just enough. Because that was the mistake. Not the guns, not the dust, not even the daylight they'd chosen to ride in under. Bold as brass, like the badge of a sheriff 100 miles off, could not reach them here. The mistake was smaller than all of that. The mistake was thinking quiet meant weak. Odessa Marsh was hanging wash on a line, strung between the house and the barn when she heard them. She didn't stop, didn't turn, kept pinning the shirt in her hands, to the rope, 1 peg, then the next. Her movements even and unhurried, like a woman with nothing on her mind but linen and afternoon light. But her eyes had already gone to the ridge. 3 riders, coming down slow, in no particular formation, the kind of slow that men rode when they believed there was no reason to hurry. She counted the rifles across their saddles, without appearing to count anything at all. Counted the angle of the sun behind her good, at her back in their eyes. Counted the distance to the door, 40 feet. Counted the distance to the well, which was closer, and had a stone lip she could drop behind if it came to that. She had been doing this kind of counting since she was 8 years old. She kept pinning laundry, because a woman who ran for the house the moment she saw riders was a woman who was afraid, and fear was a signal, same as smoke on a hilltop or a shot fired into the air. Fear told men everything they needed to know, before a single word passed between anyone. So she didn't run. She finished the shirt. Picked up the next one from the basket, at her feet, Ezra's shirt, still, a year later, because she had never been able to make herself give it away, and pinned it to the line with the same patient, deliberate hands. The riders stopped their horses 40 yards out. "Afternoon, ma'am," the lead one called, tipping his hat with a mockery of manners so thin it barely bothered to hide the intent underneath it. Young, maybe 25. A scar through one eyebrow that hadn't been there long enough to fade all the way white yet. "This your place?" "It is." Her voice carried flat and even across the yard. No fear in it. No welcome either. Pretty spread for a woman alone. "I manage." "Bet you do." He swings down off his horse, boots hitting the dirt with a sound too loud, too deliberate. A man performing confidence for an audience of 2 friends and 1 woman he had already decided didn't count as a witness. The other 2 stayed mounted, rifles resting easy across their thighs. "Name's Odessa, ain't it?" "Odessa Marsh. Though round here folks just call you the Apache widow." She said nothing, kept her hands moving. "Pin. Shirt. Pin. We're not here to trouble you none," he went on, stepping closer. Thumbs hooked in his belt. "Long as you're reasonable." Fella name of Coburn's got interest in this stretch of land. The water especially. Real generous offer on the table if you just, I'm not selling. The words came out clean, not raised, not shaking, just final, the way a door sounds when it's already closed and locked, and a man is still standing there with his hand on the knob, not yet understanding that the decision has already been made. The writer's grin thinned out at the edges. See, that's the answer we figured you'd give, he said, which is why we didn't come to ask twice. He reached for her, and that was the second mistake. What happened next took 4 seconds, maybe 5. Later, when the story traveled, and it did travel, out along the wire fences and into the saloons and across the counters of the mercantile, growing a little each time it changed hands, the way stories do in a country with more sense silence than people to fill it later, men would tell it slower than it happened. They'd stretch those 4 seconds into a whole afternoon of gunplay, because that was the only way the story made sense to them. A woman standing at a clothesline, alone, against 3 armed men, should have needed more than 4 seconds. She didn't. The clothespin was already between 2 fingers of her left hand. Her right hand had never stopped moving toward the wash basket, except it wasn't reaching for a shirt anymore. It closed instead around the walnut grip of the revolver she'd hung from a nail on the underside of the basket's rim that morning, the way she hung it there every morning, out of habit, out of the particular kind of caution a woman only learns after she has already buried someone. The gun came up, 1 shot. The rider with the scarred eyebrow was reaching for her wrist when the bullet caught him high in the shoulder and spun him backward off his feet, and he was on the ground before his own hand finished closing on nothing. The second rider's horse reared. He was already drawing, already shouting, something that never made it past the first syllable, because her next shot took the rifle clean out of his hands before his finger found the trigger, and the one after that put him on his back in the dirt, with a wound in his thigh that would keep him from ever sitting a saddle comfortably again. The third rider didn't even manage to draw. He looked at his 2 friends bleeding in the dust, looked at the woman standing by the clothesline, revolver leveled, smoke curling off the barrel, her face as calm and unhurried as it had been when she was pinning laundry 60 seconds before, and he ran his horse straight up the ridge without looking back once. Silence came down over the yard. The kind of silence that follows gunfire always sounds louder than the shots themselves. It rang in the ears. It sat on the chest. Somewhere in the barn, a horse stamped once, twice, unsettled, and then went quiet too, as if even the animals understood something had just changed. And the changing wasn't finished yet. Odessa didn't move for a long moment. She stood with the revolver still raised, her arms steady, her breath slow and even. And if a man had been watching close enough, which no man was, because the only men who might have watched were bleeding in her yard or fleeing up her ridge, he would have seen something strange in her face. Not triumph, not fear, something older than both, something that looked almost like grief, because she had promised herself she would never do this again. She lowered the gun, walked to the man with the shoulder wound first, not to finish it, but to check it, her fingers moving over the wound with the same efficient, unhurried care she'd used on the clothesline pins, pressing a folded cloth against the bleeding before he even understood what she was doing. You'll live, she said. Flat. No comfort in it. No cruelty either. He stared up at her, pale, sweating, the fight gone clean out of him. Who? He swallowed. Tried again. Who taught you to shoot like that? She didn't answer. She was already looking past him, up the ridge, to the dust cloud where the third rider had disappeared, still hanging in the air like a scar across the blue afternoon sky. Because she already knew this wasn't finished. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing, before the sky tells you anything. A pressure at the back of the skull. An old, familiar tightening low in the stomach that she hadn't felt in years, not since before Ezra. Not since before she'd folded away everything she used to be, and buried it, quite literally, beneath the floorboards of the house behind her. She looked down at the gun still in her hand. Her father's gun, 22 years old, the walnut grip worn smooth by 2 sets of hands now instead of 1, and she had told herself every single morning since she buried her husband that she would never need to draw it again for anything but coyotes and rattlesnakes. She had been wrong. The wounded man was still watching her, blood soaking through the cloth she'd pressed against his shoulder, his eyes wide with something that wasn't quite fear yet, but was getting there fast. Coburn's gonna... He started. Coburn, she repeated, testing the name. turning it over like a stone she wasn't sure she trusted the underside of. That the man who sent you? He hesitated. She didn't raise the gun again. Didn't need to. She simply looked at him, and something in that look made the hesitation collapse. Elias Coburn, he said quickly. Big spread, east of town. Wants the water rights on this section. Sent us to make you an offer you couldn't refuse. You refused for me, she said, the moment you got off that horse. She helped him to his feet, not gently, not roughly either. The way you'd help up a man you had no particular feeling about one way or the other. Because your mind was already somewhere else, entirely already climbing that ridge, already following the dust of the rider who'd fled, already reaching backward through a year of grief toward a question she had spent every single day trying not to ask. Was it Ezra? Was it Ezra they'd meant to hit that morning a year ago and gotten the wrong day, the wrong life, the wrong grave to dig? She put both wounded men on their horses. Didn't offer water. Didn't offer bandaging beyond what she'd already given, because there was a difference between mercy and softness, and she had learned that difference a long time ago, learned it the same year she learned to shoot, from the same man, in the same breath almost. Tell Coburn, she said, and her voice had gone very quiet now, quiet in the particular way that made both men go still in their saddles. Tell him the woman on this land isn't for sale, and tell him the next men he sends won't ride away. She watched them go. Watched the dust rise and fold into the dust, already hanging over the ridge, until there was nothing left up there but sky and silence, and the long gold light of late afternoon pouring down over land that had, until about 4 minutes ago, been the quietest place in the territory. Then she turned back toward the house, and her hands steady through all of it, steady through the draw and the aim and the fire, steady through binding a stranger's wound, with the same care she'd once used to bind soldiers and strangers, and men whose names she never learned. Her hands began, finally, to shake. She pressed them flat against her thighs until it stopped, because that was the rule. Her father's rule, older than she was, older than the gun in her hand. You could shake after. You could not shake during. During, you had to be still as water. Inside the house, the light fell in long amber bars through the single window, catching dust in the air, catching the edge of the table where a half-mended shirt still lay, from that morning, needles still threaded through the collar where she'd left it. She set her father's revolver down on the table, stood over it for a long moment, looking at the thing the way you might look at an old friend who has shown up at your door after years of silence, uninvited, carrying news you already suspect is bad. Then she knelt, pulled back the rug beside the hearth, found the loose board beneath it, the one nobody had ever known about. Not Ezra, not his brother Amos, not the handful of people she had trusted with almost everything else in her life. Her fingers found the edge of it, worked it up. Beneath the board, a wooden box, plain, unmarked, the kind a man might keep tools in, or seed, or nothing worth hiding at all. She didn't open it, not yet. She just laid her palm flat against the lid, the wood cool under her hand, and closed her eyes, and for one long moment allowed herself to remember, not the shooting, not Coburn's name, not the dust cloud on the ridge, but her father's voice. 20 years gone now, and still it came to her clear as a bell across water. A gun is a promise, Odessa, not a threat. And a promise, once you make it, you keep, even when it costs you everything. She had made a promise once, before Ezra, before this house, before the name Odessa Marsh had ever been attached to grief and quiet and a clothesline strung between a house and a barn. She had buried that promise the same day she buried the person she used to be. Outside, the wind picked up again, pushing through the grass, rattling the loose shutter on the north side of the house, the one Ezra had always meant to fix and never got around to. And somewhere far off, faint, carried on that same wind, a coyote called once into the coming dark. Odessa Marsh knelt beside the hearth, with her hand on a box she had not opened in years. And for the first time since she'd buried her husband, she was afraid. Not of the men who'd ridden away, of the ones still coming. She did not open the box that night. Instead, she banked the fire, ate nothing, and sat for a long time at the table with the mended shirt in her lap, the needle still through the collar where she'd left it that morning, in a life that already felt like it belonged to someone else. Sleep, when it finally came, did not come gently. It came the way it always came on the bad nights, sideways, sudden, pulling her backward through 20 years in the space of a single breath. down through the grief and the marriage and the burying of two men she had loved in two different ways, down to a place before any of that had happened, back to a stretch of red rock country in the Nations, where a girl of 8 stood in the white glare of noon, with a revolver too heavy for her hand. Kansas Territory. 20 years gone. The gun was her father's old Remington, and it hung in her small hands like a piece of iron dropped from the sky, and she remembered even now, even asleep, even 20 years and a whole life later, how the weight of it had pulled her wrist down toward the dirt before she learned to fight it. Elbow locked, Silas Marsh said. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice, not once in all the years she knew him, and that was its own kind of lesson, though she hadn't understood it yet at 8 years old. Not stiff, locked. There's a difference. I don't know the difference. You will. He crouched beside her in the dust, close enough that she could smell tobacco and horse, and the particular dry smell of a man who spent his life outdoors, and he took her small wrist in his hand and adjusted it. An inch. Maybe less. Now, he said, tell me what you see. The bottle. What else? Just the bottle. Wrong. He tapped 2 fingers against her temple. Gentle. No scold in it. You see the wind in the grass behind it. You see the sun's coming from your left, which means your shadow's falling right, which means if a man's watching you from that ridge yonder, he sees exactly where your gun hand's about to go before you go there. You see all of it. Every time. Or you don't see anything at all. She'd fired that day. Missed the bottle by a hand's width. Fired again. Missed by less. By the 20th shot, the bottle was a spray of green glass catching afternoon light, and her father hadn't said a word of praise. Not one, because praise wasn't the point, and never had been, again was all he said. They did this every day for 6 years. Not because he wanted a killer for a daughter. She understood that now, understood it in a way she hadn't at 8, or 10, or even 16. Understood it only after she'd buried him, and had years alone to turn the memory over like a stone, looking at every side of it. He hadn't wanted a killer. He'd wanted a survivor. There was a difference, he used to say. A killer looks for reasons to draw. A survivor prays every single day she never has to, and trains anyway, because the day doesn't ask your permission before it arrives. She remembered the last of it too, in the dream, the way dreams fold years into seconds without asking. 14 men had come to bury Silas Marsh. Lawmen, mostly. A few outlaws, too, standing at a respectful distance because even outlaws had understood something about her father that made them take their hats off at his grave. He'd died the way he'd lived, quiet, deliberate, taken down by a single shot from a man he'd once shown mercy to, on a cattle trail 2 counties over, a man who hadn't earned the second chance he was given, and used it instead to put a bullet in the back of the only lawman who'd ever bothered to offer him one. That was the last lesson he ever taught her, though he hadn't meant to teach it. Mercy has a cost. Pay it with your eyes open, or don't pay it at all. She was 14 when they lowered him into Kansas dirt, and she remembered standing at the grave's edge with her father's Remington belted at her hip, his gift to her. The only thing of value he'd left behind besides the lessons, and she remembered thinking, with a clarity that frightened her, even then, I will never let anyone bury someone I love again without knowing exactly why. She had broken that promise, once already, a year ago, when they lowered Ezra into ground not so different from her father's. She had told herself his death was an accident, a fall from a bad horse on a bad trail in bad light. She had told herself that because the alternative that she hadn't looked closely enough, hadn't asked the right questions, hadn't used the eyes. Her father spent 6 years training into her, was a weight she had not been ready to carry. She was starting to understand, lying in that bed, with the fire gone down to embers, that she was going to have to carry it now, whether she was ready or not. She woke before dawn, the way she always did, the sky outside still more black than gray. And she lay still for a long moment, listening to the house settle around her, listening for anything that didn't belong. Nothing. Just wind, and the old shutter Ezra never fixed, ticking faintly against its frame. She rose, dressed, built up the fire, and for the first time in a year, she did not put her father's revolver back on its nail beneath the wash basket. She kept it on her hip. Word of what happened at the Marsh Place reached town before noon. It traveled the way news always traveled in a country this empty mouth to mouth, rider to rider, growing a little heavier and a little stranger with every hand it passed through. until by the time it reached the saloon on Prescott Street, it had already stopped being a story about three men and a woman, and had become, instead, a story about a legend nobody in town had known was living 12 miles out on the Coburn Road. Three of Coburn's boys, the bartender, was saying, wiping a glass he'd already wiped twice, shot clean off their horses. By a woman. Alone. Which woman? The Apache widow. Marsh's girl. Ezra's wife Ezra that passed a year back. A pause fell over the room. Not disbelief exactly. Something closer to recalculation. The sound of men quietly rearranging what they thought they knew about a quiet woman on a quiet stretch of land. Marsh, an old cattleman at the end of the bar, said slowly, turning the name over in his mouth like it tasted of something half forgotten. His name was Purdy Jessup, and he had been drinking alone at that same stool most evenings for longer than anyone in the room could remember. Silas Marsh? That's what I heard. Jessup set his glass down. Didn't pick it back up for a long moment. Rode with him once, he said finally. Long time back, up in the Nations, before any of you pups were old enough to hold a gun steady. He turned the glass slowly on the bar, watching the lamplight catch and slide across the amber liquid inside. Man never raised his voice in his whole life, far as I ever saw. Never had to. You'd see him walk into a room full of drunk, armed men looking for trouble, and something about the way he carried himself, easy, patient, like he had all the time in the world, and not one drop of fear in him, something about that, just took the fight clean out of a room before a word got said. And his girl shoots the same way? From what I'm hearing. Jessup looked up, and something almost like sorrow moved behind his eyes. Man like Silas Marsh didn't train a daughter to shoot like that. For sport, boys. He trained her because he already knew, deep down, that the world was going to come looking for her one day, same as it came looking for him. And a man who loves his child enough to see that coming makes sure she's ready for it, whatever the cost. The saloon had gone quiet around him, every man turning the old cattleman's words over in his mind, the way men do when something true has been said plain in a room full of speculation. Nobody in that room yet understood how much truer it was than any of them could guess. 12 miles out, at the Marsh Place, Amos rode in just after midday, his horse lathered from a hard ride, his face carrying the particular tightness of a man who has heard a story twice removed and cannot make himself believe it until he sees it with his own eyes. He was Ezra's younger brother, though nobody who met the two of them together would have guessed it from looks alone. Ezra had carried their father's build, broad through the shoulders, while Amos had come out lean and quicker with his temper too, though the years since the funeral had worn most of that quickness down into something more careful. He found Odessa in the yard, mending the same clothesline the riders had interrupted the day before, as if the whole thing had been nothing more than a chore left unfinished. They're saying he started, and then stopped, because saying it out loud in front of her made it feel suddenly, uncomfortably real. They're saying you put down 3 of Coburn's men. By yourself. They came onto my land, she said, not looking up from the rope in her hands. Threatened me, I answered. He repeated the word like it tasted strange in his mouth. Odessa. Nobody answers 3 armed men and walks away without a scratch. Not unless he stopped again. She finally looked at him. And whatever was in her face in that moment, steady, unreadable, carrying something old and guarded far behind her eyes, made the rest of his sentence die in his throat. Unless what, Amos? He shook his head slowly, looked away, out toward the ridge, where the dust had long since settled, where nothing remained of yesterday's violence except 2 sets of hoofprints heading east, and the memory already spreading through every saloon and kitchen in the territory. Ezra never told me you could shoot like that, he said quietly. Ezra didn't know, she said. And something in the way she said it flat, final, closing like a door, told Amos that there was a great deal about his brother's wife, that his brother had never known either, and that the not knowing might have cost Ezra more than any of them had understood at the time. He didn't ask the next question. Not yet. But it sat between them in the yard, heavy as the afternoon heat, unspoken and impossible now to unhear. What else are you hiding, Odessa? And did it have anything to do with the night we buried my brother? The territorial marshal for that district was a man named Hollis Bragg, and he rode out to the Marsh Place. 2 days later, unhurried, the way a man rides when the crime in question has already resolved itself without him. He was not a bad man. That much Odessa could tell within the first 5 minutes of his visit. Tired eyes. A badge worn dull from years of honest, thankless work. A voice that carried more weariness than authority. He had held this district for 11 years, had buried 2 deputies, and outlived 3 territorial governors, and somewhere in all of that had settled into the particular, hard-won patience of a lawman who no longer expected the job to be fair, only to be done. Ma'am. He tipped his hat, stayed mounted, the way careful men did when they weren't yet sure what kind of welcome they'd find. Heard there was some trouble out here. There was. Mind telling me what happened? She told him. The same version she'd give to anyone who asked 3 riders, an offer she'd refused, a hand reached toward her that she hadn't asked to be reached, and a response she did not apologize for and did not embellish either. She left out the part about the washbasket revolver, hung on its nail each morning like a small, private ritual of grief and readiness both. She left out the part about the box beneath the floorboard. Bragg listened without writing anything down. When she finished, he sat quiet on his horse for a long moment, studying her the way a man studies a fence line he suspects has been moved, in the night, not accusing exactly, just recalculating. 3 shots, he said finally. 3 men down. No powder burns close enough to call it point blank. Way I heard it told in town. That's right. That's a fair distance for 3 clean hits, ma'am. Fair distance for anybody. I had a good teacher. Must have. He looked at her a moment longer. Then quieter, almost to himself. Army trains men to shoot like that. Or somebody who spent a long while doing it professional. Not many folks come by that kind of hand on a sewing needle and a clothesline. She said nothing. He didn't push it. That was the thing about Hollis Bragg that she would come to understand better. In the weeks ahead, he was not a man who chased answers. He suspected he wasn't owed yet. He simply filed the question away, the way a careful man files away every loose thread, in case the day came when he needed to pull on it. I'll write it up as self-defense, he said, gathering his reins. Coburn's boys started it. 3 witnesses in town will swear to the reputation those men carried before they ever rode out here. Won't be trouble for you on my end. Thank you, Marshal. Don't thank me yet. He turned his horse, then paused, looking back at her with something that might have been sympathy, or might have simply been the tired honesty of a man who had seen enough of this territory's violence to know where it usually led. Man like Coburn doesn't take a loss quiet. You put 3 of his men in the dirt. One of them's likely to walk with a limp the rest of his days. That's not the kind of thing a man like that lets settle. I know. Then you also know this isn't finished. I know that too. He rode off down the trail, and she stood watching until the dust of him disappeared over the rise, and only then did she let herself say, quietly, to no one, the thing she had not told him. It was never Coburn I was worried about. The wounded man's blood-crusted vest had been left behind in her yard, discarded in the panic of the retreat, and she found it 2 mornings later half buried under a drift of blown dust near the well. She almost didn't check it. But her father's voice was in her again. Check everything, Odessa. A careless man leaves more truth behind than a careful one ever means to. And so she knelt in the dirt and went through the pockets with the same patient, unhurried care she'd used on the man's wound. A few coins. A folding knife. A crumpled letter, half torn, addressed to nobody she recognized. And a small brass token, no bigger than a coin, stamped with a crude image she did not recognize at first, a coyote's head in profile. Teeth bared, circled by a ring of 5 stars. She turned it over in her fingers for a long time. Because she had seen a mark like that before. Not this exact one, this was newer, cruder, the work of some frontier tinsmith rather than a proper mint, but the shape of it, the idea of it, tugged at something buried so deep in her memory that for a moment she couldn't place it at all, and then all at once she could. A coyote circled by stars. Coil's mark. The name arrived in her chest like a physical blow, like a door slamming somewhere far off in a house she'd thought was empty, and she sat back on her heels in the dust with the token pressed hard into her palm, her breath gone suddenly shallow and fast. Because Barnaby Coil did not send men after ranch land. Barnaby Coil sent men after debts. And there was only one debt in the whole territory old enough, deep enough, bitter enough to bring a man like that, riding this far west after 8 years of silence. 200 miles east, in a canyon town too small and too lawless to appear on any territorial map worth trusting, Barnaby Coil sat in the back room of a cantina, with his boots propped on a table, and a whiskey he hadn't touched in an hour. Listening to the lone survivor of the Marsh Ranch tell his story for the third time, she come up with the gun already in her hand. Mr. Coil. Wasn't even a full breath between her seeing us and Danny hitting the dirt. Coil did not move, did not speak. He was a broad-shouldered man past 50 now, gray threading heavy through a beard he kept close-cropped out of habit more than vanity, and the stillness that came over him when he was thinking was, in its own way, almost as unsettling as violence would have been. 3 shots, he said finally. Yes, sir. Nobody wasted. No, sir. Clean as anything I ever seen. Coil set his glass down. He had spent 8 years chasing a ghost across 4 territories. 8 years of dead ends and false trails, and men who swore they'd seen her in Santa Fe, in Silver City, in a mining camp outside Bisbee that turned out to hold nothing but a frightened schoolteacher who happened to share a first initial. 8 years since his younger brother Dell had been laid out cold in a stagecoach robbery. Gone wrong outside Cimarron Pass, put down by a shotgun rider. Nobody in the gang had ever gotten a clear look at. They'd called her the Cimarron Ghost back then, because nobody could confirm she was even real. A rumor. A story stagecoach companies told to scare off would-be robbers. Some men in Coil's old outfit had sworn up and down there was no ghost at all, that Dell had simply been unlucky, shot by some green deputy who'd gotten credited with more skill than he deserved. Coil had never believed that. He'd seen the wounds on his brother's body with his own eyes. Center mass, precise as a surgeon's hand, fired from a moving stagecoach at a distance most men couldn't hit a barn from. That wasn't luck. That wasn't some green deputy. That was a professional. And about a year back, a thin lead had finally surfaced, a whisper from an old informant, that a woman matching the shape of that old rumor had married into a ranching family somewhere near the San Carlos boundary. Coils had sent 2 men out quiet to look around, see if the whisper had legs, careful not to spook whatever they might find. They had come back with nothing. No confrontation, no denial, only a vague and unsatisfying report that the country out that way was too broad and too well guarded by silence to search properly without drawing attention neither of them wanted to draw. One of the 2 men had seemed unsettled by something he wouldn't fully explain mentioned, almost in passing, some trouble on a wash trail that hadn't gone the way he expected, and then the lead had simply gone quiet again, the way leads did, swallowed back into the vast indifference of the territory. Coil had let it drop, told himself not for the first time that 8 years was long enough to chase a shadow that might not even exist. He had been wrong about that, too. Coburn's woman, he said slowly, almost to himself. The Apache widow. That's what they're calling her, sir. Yes, sir. Coil picked his glass back up, finally drank. 8 years, he said. 8 years I've been asking every stagecoach driver, every deputy, every 2-bit bounty man from here to the Rio Grande if they'd ever heard of a shooter who could put 3 rounds where they needed to go without wasting a 4th. He set the glass down again, looked toward the window, toward the west, toward a stretch of dry Arizona grassland he had never once set eyes on, but could suddenly picture with unsettling clarity a small adobe house, a clothesline, a woman standing calm as still water, while 3 armed men made the worst decision of their lives. And here she's been, he said quietly, 12 miles outside a nothing town, hanging laundry. He almost smiled. It was not a pleasant thing to see. Saddle the horses, he said, all of them, and send word to Dobbs, tell him, I need every scrap of paper his office has got on stage line shooters working the Cimarron route between 78 and 82. Names, descriptions, anything with a woman's hand in it. You think it's really her, sir? After all this time? Barnaby Coil stood, and for the first time in 8 long years, something that might once have been called grief moved across his face and hardened in an instant into something far colder. I think, he said, Dell's finally going to get his answer. At the Coburn ranch, 20 miles from the Marsh Place, Elias Coburn listened to his surviving man's account of the shooting, with his jaw set tight and his hands folded very still on the desk in front of him, the particular stillness of a man working hard to keep his temper from showing before he'd decided what use the temper might be put to. 3 shots, he repeated, once the man finished. You're telling me a rancher's widow put 3 of my hired guns in the dirt with 3 shots? Yes, sir. Wasn't natural the way she moved. Wasn't natural at all. Coburn said nothing for a long moment. He was not, by nature, a patient man, and the water rights on the marsh section had been a simple matter in his mind. For months now, an old rancher's trick. Pressure applied steadily, until pressure became the only reasonable choice remaining. He had not expected complications. He certainly had not expected to lose 3 men and gain in the trade, a reputation traveling through every saloon in the territory that made his own name sound, by comparison, considerably smaller than it had a week ago. "Marshal's calling it self-defense," the man added carefully. "I don't care what the marshal's calling it." Coburn's voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone hard and cold. "I care that half the county's laughing about Coburn's boys getting shot off their horses by a seamstress. That's not a story I intend to let stand. So we ride out again? Bigger party this time?" Coburn was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the long gold stretch of his own land, thinking. "No," he said finally. "Not yet. A woman who can shoot like that didn't learn it hanging laundry. There's more to this than water rights, and I don't move again till I know what it is." He looked back at his man, something calculating settling into his expression now, replacing the anger. "Ask around. Quiet-like. I want to know everything there is to know about Odessa Marsh before I send another man near that property." He did not yet know how close, without meaning to. He had come to asking the same question already being answered 200 miles east by a man with a coyote token on his belt buckle and 8 years of grief sharpened down into something far more patient and far more dangerous than a rancher's wounded pride. Back at the Marsh Place, the night had gone full dark, and Odessa sat at her table, turning the brass token slowly under the lamplight, watching the coyote's snarling profile catch and lose the flame with every small rotation. She had seen a mark like it once before. Not this exact one, this was newer cruder, but she remembered it from the one time she'd glimpsed it up close. In the second before she fired, on the belt of a man reaching for a shotgun aimed at a stage full of strangers who had done nothing to deserve what was coming to them. She had not known his name was Coil. Not that day. She had learned it after, the way you learn things after secondhand, through newspapers and whispered talk in stage depots. The way you learn the size of a stone only once. It's already sunk you. 8 years. She had told herself 8 years was long enough. Long enough for a debt like that to go cold. Long enough for a dead man's people to move on to other grudges, other territories, other ghosts to chase. She understood now, sitting alone in lamplight with a dead man's brother's mark pressed into her palm, that she had been telling herself a story. A comfortable one. The kind of story a person builds when the truth is too heavy to carry every single day. And so you set it down somewhere quiet and pretend, eventually, that it has simply disappeared. It had not disappeared. It had only been waiting. Amos came back 2 evenings later, and this time he did not stay in the yard. She let him in, poured coffee, neither of them drank. And for a long while they simply sat across the table from each other in a silence that had been building. She understood now. For the better part of a year since the funeral, since the last time, either of them had said Ezra's name out loud without their voice catching on it. "I need to ask you something," Amos said finally, "and I need you not to look away from me when you answer it all right. The morning Ezra died." He said it slow, careful, like a man setting his feet on ice he wasn't sure would hold. "You told me you told everyone." His horse spooked on the Deadman Wash trail. Through him, bad light, bad footing. "An accident. That's what happened, is it?" She held his gaze. Didn't blink. Didn't reach for the coffee. Didn't fold her hands. Didn't do any of the small things a person does when they need somewhere to put their hands so their face doesn't have to carry the whole weight of a lie alone. Because it wasn't entirely a lie. That was what made it so hard to hold steady against. She had believed it mostly for a long time. She had wanted to believe it so badly that she had simply stopped asking the questions. Her father raised her to ask. "There were riders on the ridge that morning," Amos said. "2 of them. I saw the dust myself from my own place, before I even knew anything had happened to Ezra. Never thought nothing of it at the time. Riders pass through, it doesn't mean nothing most days. But I've been turning it over for a year now, Odessa. 2 riders on the ridge, above Deadman Wash, the same morning my brother's horse just happens to spook on a trail he'd ridden 100 times before without trouble." Her hands finally went still on the table. Too still. "You never told me this. I never had a reason to think it mattered." His voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word. until 3 men rode onto your land talking about buying you out, and you put all 3 of them down without breaking a sweat, and now half the territory's whispering your daddy's name like it. Explain something the rest of us never got told. He leaned forward. So I'm asking you plain, Odessa. Because I loved my brother, and because whatever's true, I need to hear it from you, before I hear it from a stranger in town. His eyes, dark and tired and grieving in a way that hadn't softened in a year, held hers without wavering. Was somebody after you before Ezra died? And did it get him killed instead? The question landed in the small room like a dropped stone, and for a long moment there was no sound at all, except the fire settling in the hearth and the wind working at that same loose shutter, always that shutter, as if the house itself had never once stopped, trying to tell someone the truth. Odessa closed her eyes, because until this moment, she had allowed herself the mercy of not knowing, of grief without guilt attached to it, grief that was simply grief and not also a verdict on every choice she'd made in the year before it. She was not sure she could afford that mercy anymore. I don't know, she said, and her voice, for the first time since the riders had come down off the ridge days earlier, was not steady at all. I don't know, Amos, but I'm going to find out. I owe him that much. I owe you that much. And if the answer's what I think it is, she opened her eyes. Then I'll finish what I started a long time ago, she said, before any of us knew each other's names. He left before full dark, and she stood in the doorway, watching his horse carry him back up the trail, back toward his own small piece of land, and his own year of unspoken grief. And only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded entirely into the evening did she go back inside and kneel again beside the hearth. This time she did not stop at laying her hand on the box. This time she pulled back the loose board, lifted the wooden lid, and made herself look. Inside, a folded gray shirt, sun-faded, the kind a working man wore beneath a stage company's uniform coat. A shotgun shell, empty, kept for reasons she could no longer fully explain even to herself. A small tintype photograph, corners worn soft from handling, of a girl no older than 19 standing beside a stagecoach with a shotgun cradled easy across her arms and an expression on her face that held none of the softness people expected from a young woman in a photograph, only a flat, watchful readiness that the camera had somehow managed to catch anyway. And beneath all of it, folded into quarters, brittle at the creases from years of not being touched, a weathered handbill, the ink gone brown with age, the kind that used to hang in every stage depot and marshal's office between Santa Fe and the Colorado line. She unfolded it with hands that had gone, despite everything, almost steady again. The old stillness rising up to meet the old fear, the way it always had, the way her father had trained it to. Reward 500. Sought in connection with the deaths of 3 men. Cimarron Line robbery. Spring of 1880. Description: female. Early 20s. Expert marksman. Known among stage crews as the Cimarron Ghost. Identity unconfirmed. Whereabouts unknown. She stared at the paper for a long time. At the words identity unconfirmed, which had been true for 8 years and would stop being true the moment Barnaby Coil's men found the right person to ask the right question of. At the words whereabouts unknown, which had also been true for 8 years and were no longer true at all, not since 3 of Elias Coburn's hired guns had ridden home with 3 matching wounds and a story that would not stop traveling. Outside, the wind pushed once more against the loose shutter, and somewhere far off closer than a coyote's call this time, though she could not have said how she knew the difference, a horse nickered low in the dark. Odessa Marsh folded the handbill back along its old, familiar creases, pressed it flat against her chest. For one long moment, the way a person holds something they have spent years trying to forget and are only now allowing themselves to fully remember. Then she looked up, toward the window, toward the dark, pressing close against the glass, and said the words out loud for the first time in years, not to Amos, not to the marshal, not to anyone at all except the empty room and the ghost of her own reflection in the black glass. They found me. She did not sleep after that. She sat instead with the lamp burned low and let the memory take her all the way back, further than she had allowed it in years, back to the spring of 1880, and a stagecoach rattling hard along the Cimarron Line with $60,000 in mining payroll locked beneath its floor. She had been 19. Her father had been dead 5 years by then, and the money he'd left her What little there was of it had run dry the winter before, and so she had done the only thing a young woman with a dead lawman's training and no family left to speak of could reasonably do in that country. She had answered an advertisement. Stage line seeks armed rider. Discretion assured. Fair wage. They hadn't asked her name. Not really. Hadn't cared to. A shotgun rider who could hit what she aimed at was worth more to a stage company than a shotgun rider whose past made for polite conversation. And so she had ridden the boot of that coach for 2 years under no name at all, beyond the one the crews gave her among themselves, half in respect and half in unease. Ghost. Because she rode silent. Because she never spoke more than the job required. Because more than one outlaw who tried his luck against that particular coach walked away or didn't walk away at all, swearing the shots had come from nowhere, from no one, from something closer to weather than to a person. The morning of the Cimarron robbery had started like every other morning. Gray light. Cold coffee. The driver, an old man named Cassidy, who'd chewed tobacco and never once asked her a personal question in 2 years of riding together, checking the harness with the same slow care he always did. They hit the coach 4 miles past the pass. 5 men, and she remembered even now, even 9 years later, sitting alone in an Arizona kitchen, with the memory pulled up whole and sharp as the day had happened. She remembered the particular stillness that came over her, the moment she saw them break from the rocks. Not fear. Something quieter. Something her father had spent 6 years training into her, until it no longer felt like a choice at all, only a kind of weather, passing through her body and clearing again just as fast. Cassidy took a bullet in the first exchange. Not fatal, but enough to put him down hard against the boot, cursing through his teeth. The reins tangled loose in his good hand while the team spooked and the coach lurched sideways on the trail. She had fired from a moving box on a bucking road, with a wounded driver bleeding against her leg and 4 passengers screaming somewhere in the compartment below her. 3 shots. The first man down before he'd finished raising his rifle. The second, before he understood the first, was already dead. The third, the one with the coyote token on his belt buckle, the one who would turn out, though she wouldn't learn this for weeks, to be a 23-year-old named Del Coyle, riding his first real job with an outfit that had promised him easy money and delivered instead a grave outside a nameless stretch of New Mexico scrubland. The third man she had not wanted to shoot at all. She remembered that clearly. The half-second of hesitation. Because he was young and his rifle had jammed, and for one breath she had thought he might simply turn and run. He hadn't run. He had dropped the rifle and gone for a revolver instead, and her father's voice had risen up in her, calm as ever, over the noise of the horses and Cassidy's ragged breathing and the passengers screaming below. Every promise you make, you keep, even the ones that cost you. She had kept it. 2 men remaining had broken and run. The coach had rolled on, wounded but whole. 4 passengers alive, and $60,000 of mining payroll delivered exactly where it was meant to go. And by the time word of the robbery reached the nearest town, the story had already grown a life of its own. The Cimarron Ghost, they called her. A shooter no one could name and no one could find. A legend built entirely out of 3 bodies, and a silence nobody had managed to break. She had ridden 2 more years after that. Then, quietly, without announcement, without so much as giving the stage company proper notice, she had simply stopped, sold the shotgun, bought a plain dress and a plain name, and rode west into a stretch of Arizona territory where nobody knew the word ghost at all. 5 years ago now, if she counted it honest. 5 years since a cold morning at a trading post on the edge of the San Carlos boundary, where a young rancher from the settlement nearby had looked at her across the counter with an openness in his face that felt, after 2 years of silence and gunsmoke, almost unbearably kind. She had met him arguing, gently, with the trader over the price of a length of blue calico, not for himself, she would learn later, but for his younger sister, who had asked for it as a gift, and did not know he'd had to trade 3 days' labor to afford even the trader's first unreasonable price. Odessa had watched him from across the room for a full minute before she understood what she was watching. A grown man, broad through the shoulders, capable looking in the particular way of someone who worked hard land for a living, arguing patiently over pennies for a piece of cloth that meant nothing to anyone in that room except the sister who wasn't even present to see it. She had not meant to speak, had trained herself, across 2 years on a stagecoach, and God knew how many more before that, to stay quiet in rooms full of strangers, to watch and count exits and say nothing that might be remembered later. But something about the patience in his voice had undone that training entirely, and before she understood what she was doing, she had stepped forward and told the trader that she would cover the difference herself, and could he please just sell the man his sister's cloth. Ezra had turned to look at her then. Really look, the way almost no one had looked at her in years, not sizing her up, not calculating what she might be worth or what she might be hiding, just looking, open and curious and faintly, helplessly amused. "You didn't need to do that," he'd said. "I know," she'd answered. "I wanted to." He had walked her to her horse afterward, in no hurry at all, despite the cold, and asked her name, and she had given it to him, her real name, her father's name, Odessa Marsh, spoken out loud to another living person for the first time in 2 years without a single flicker of hesitation. It had felt, in that moment, like setting down a weight she hadn't fully realized she was still carrying. She married him 7 months later, in a small ceremony that mixed her father's Kansas upbringing with Ezra's own family's ways in a manner that satisfied no one's expectations perfectly, and pleased everyone present completely. And for 4 years she had allowed herself something she had not believed, at 19 years old, on the boot of a stagecoach, she would ever be permitted to have: an ordinary life. A husband who asked no questions she wasn't ready to answer, not because he lacked curiosity, but because he seemed to understand. In some quiet and generous way, she had never fully explained to him, and he had never fully demanded she explain, that some doors were better left for a person to open in their own time. She had always meant to tell him, someday, when enough years had passed that the telling would feel like history instead of confession. The years had run out before she found the courage. She had never told him, because some part of her, some old and careful part her father had built into her, before she was even old enough to understand what she was being built for, had believed that silence was the only thing keeping the past from ever finding its way to her door. She understood now, sitting alone, with a handbill folded back along its old creases, exactly how wrong that belief had been. 200 miles east, in the same cantina back room, Barnaby Coil read the telegram twice before he allowed himself to believe it. Dobbs' office, it read, in the clipped hand of a federal registrar's clerk. Cimarron Line stage records 1,878.82. No female riders on payroll per official record. However, unofficial note from retired agent suggests unregistered rider used by line during that period. Paid cash. No name kept. Agent recalls girl married into a family near San Carlos some years back. Will forward full details for usual fee. Coil folded the telegram slowly. He had been chasing shadows for 8 years, false leads, dead ends, 100 women in 100 towns who'd shared nothing with his brother's killer beyond the simple damning fact of being capable with a gun. He had learned, over those years, not to trust hope. Hope was a debt collector's worst habit. His own father used to say, back before his father died, with debts of his own left unpaid. Hope made a man see what he wanted instead of what was actually standing in front of him. But this fit closer than any lead he'd chased in 8 years of careful, patient work. A cash-paid rider, unnamed, gone from the Cimarron Line around 82, married into a family near the same stretch of San Carlos country. His own men had gone quiet in less than a year ago. He thought of Dell, 23 years old, 3 months into his first real job, dead in the dirt outside Cimarron Pass, with his rifle jammed, and his revolver never even cleared from the holster. He thought of his mother, in the years after, asking him every single letter he sent home, whether he'd found who did it yet, until the asking had finally stopped, not because she'd forgiven the world for taking her youngest son, but because she'd died herself before an answer ever came. 8 years. He poured himself another whiskey, and for once drank the whole of it. "Get the horses," he told the man waiting by the door, "and find me Garrett Voss. Man's got the best nose for a cold trail of anybody I ever paid, and I want him riding for Arizona inside the week. Voss doesn't come cheap, sir. Voss doesn't need to come cheap." Barnaby Coil stood, and in the lamplight, his shadow stretched long and broad across the cantina's rough plank wall, swallowing the small room entire. He just needs to come. 300 miles east of that, in a cramped government office that smelled of dust and old paper, and the particular staleness of a room where very little honest work got done, a man named Elton Dobbs sat with a locked drawer open in front of him and a stack of bills he had not yet found the nerve to count in front of the courier who'd delivered them. He was a small man, in every sense that mattered. Small in build, small in ambition, small in the particular courage it would have taken, years ago, to refuse the first quiet bribe that had ever come across his desk and set him on the path that led to this drawer, this stack of bills, this late hour spent alone with a decision he had already made long before Barnaby Coil's letter ever reached him. Federal Bounty Registrar was a title that sounded, on paper, like it carried some measure of importance. In practice, it meant Dobbs kept records, old records, forgotten records, the kind of paperwork that mattered enormously to exactly the sort of men who could afford to make it worth his while to go looking for them, and to almost no one else in the entire territory. He had found what Coil wanted 3 days ago, an old stage company payroll ledger, water-damaged and nearly illegible, listing a cash payment made without a name-attached standard practice. He knew, for stage lines running dangerous routes, since a writer willing to carry a shotgun against outlaws for a living rarely wanted her identity permanently attached to federal paperwork. But ledgers, even careless ones, left traces. A supervisor's note in the margin. A retired agent, tracked down after considerable effort and a bribe of his own, who remembered vaguely, uncertainly, but remembered a quiet young writer who'd left the line around 82 and was rumored, years later, to have married into a family near the San Carlos boundary. Dobbs had written it all down, sold it along with everything else for a sum of money that would keep his small, careful life comfortable for a considerable while. He told himself, as he finally began counting the bills in front of him, that it was only paperwork, old records changing hands, nothing more. He did not let himself think too closely about what a man like Barnaby Coil intended to do with a name and a location. Once he had them both in hand, some doors, Dobbs told himself, folding the money carefully into his coat, were better left unopened by the person who'd sold the key. He locked the drawer, blew out the lamp, and went home to a supper he had by now long since lost any real taste for. The stars were still out when Odessa finally went back inside, though the eastern sky had begun to pale toward the gray that comes just before true morning, and she moved through the small house with a settled purpose that had not been there a week before. She checked her father's revolver once more, cleaned it, though it did not need cleaning. Laid out, on the table beside it, the tintype photograph and the folded handbill, and the brass tokens stamped with a snarling coyote's head, 3 small pieces of a past she could no longer afford to keep buried. She thought of Amos's question, still unanswered, of Marshal Bragg's tired warning that this wasn't finished. She understood, with the particular clarity that comes to a person only after they've stopped running from a truth long enough to finally look it full in the face, that there would not always be a next time where the sound in the dark turned out to be nothing. Somewhere out past the ridge, men were riding toward her who did not yet know her name, but who would soon enough know it better than almost anyone left alive. Somewhere behind her, a good man lay buried on a small rise with a truth about his death still waiting to be uncovered. And somewhere inside her, buried longer and deeper than either grave, a girl in a faded tintype photograph stood waiting, patient as ever, for the moment she would finally be allowed to step back out into the daylight. Odessa Marsh rose from the table, crossed to the small cedar chest at the foot of the bed she had shared with Ezra, and drew out, from beneath a folded quilt, the gun belt she had not worn since the day she rode into this territory and became someone new. The leather was stiff with disuse. She worked it in her hands for a long while, softening it the way her father had taught her to soften a new holster, slow, patient, never forcing the leather faster than it wanted to give. Then she buckled it on, checked her father's revolver, loaded it full, settled it into the holster at her hip with a small, practiced motion that came back to her body faster than she expected, faster than years of quiet farm life should have allowed, as though some part of her had simply been waiting, the whole time, for permission to remember. "All right," she said quietly, to the empty room, to Ezra's memory, to her father's, to the girl in the tintype, who had never once flinched from a fight she hadn't started. "Let's find out who's really coming." Whatever the truth turned out to be about Ezra, about Coburn, about the ghost of a stagecoach robbery, 8 years gone, she intended to walk toward it with her eyes open, exactly the way her father had raised her to. Still as water, until the moment came. Garrett Voss rode into the small town nearest the San Carlos boundary on the fourth day, and he did not go near the marshal's office, and he did not go near the Marsh Place, and he did not ask a single direct question of anyone. He had learned, across a long career, that direct questions were the fastest way to teach a ghost you were coming. Instead, he took a room above the mercantile, paid a week in advance in a manner calculated to look like a man in no particular hurry, and spent his first evening simply sitting in the corner of the saloon with a beer he barely touched, listening. The town, he discovered quickly, was more than willing to talk without being asked. The shooting out at the Marsh Place had become the only subject anyone in the room seemed interested in discussing, and Voss sat quiet in his corner, absorbing every version of it, filtering the exaggeration from the fact with the patient, practiced ear of a man who had spent 20 years learning to hear the true shape of a story underneath its decoration. A woman who never flinched, a dead husband, a year gone, buried on a rise behind the house. A father who had trained her from childhood the way some men trained horses, because he had understood, even then, that the world she was born into did not extend much mercy to a woman alone. He turned the details over carefully as he climbed the stairs to his room that night, laying them alongside everything Coil's stolen records had already told him. A cash-paid stage rider, unnamed, gone from the Cimarron Line since '82, married into a family near this exact stretch of territory not long after. It fit closer than any lead he'd chased in weeks of careful work. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed. For a long while, the lamp turned low, and allowed himself, for the first time since accepting the assignment, to picture the woman at the center of it, not as a target, not as a payday, but as a person. A girl trained young by a father who saw trouble coming for her long before it arrived. A rider who never fired first, by every account he'd managed to gather. A widow, grieving, who had put down 3 armed men without flinching, and then, from what the town was saying, gone right back to hanging her laundry, as though nothing at all had happened. That did not sound, to Garrett Voss's considerable experience, like a killer running from justice. It sounded like someone who had spent her whole life being hunted by circumstance, and had simply finally gotten tired enough of running to stand her ground instead. He had taken worse jobs for worse men. He had also, on a handful of occasions across a long and complicated career, walked away from a job entirely, once the shape of it came clear enough to trouble his conscience. He did not know yet which kind of job this one was going to turn out to be. He blew out the lamp. 12 miles away, unaware that the circle had already begun closing around her, Odessa Marsh slept at last, her father's revolver within easy reach on the table beside the bed, and dreamed for the first time in a long while not of gunfire, but of a stagecoach rolling steady down a long, quiet road toward a horizon she could not quite make out. Morning came gray and cold over the whole stretch of territory, touching the Marsh Place and Amos's small house and the hotel room where Garrett Voss lay listening to the town wake up below his window, and touching, far to the east, a cantina where Barnaby Coil was already saddling his horse before full light. 8 years of patience, finally beginning at long last to move. 3 separate roads, converging slowly toward the same quiet piece of Arizona ground. Odessa Marsh woke that morning the way she had every morning that week, early, alert, her father's revolver within easy reach, and stepped out into the cold gray light to find the world exactly as she'd left it the night before. Quiet, watchful, waiting. She did not yet know Garrett Voss's name, or the shape of the offer Barnaby Coil intended to make her, or the full truth of what had happened to her husband, on a trail he'd ridden 100 times before without trouble. She only knew, standing in that cold morning light, with her hand resting easy near her hip, that the woman who had spent years hiding beneath a floorboard and a borrowed name was not coming back. The Cimarron ghost had been sleeping a long time. She was awake now, and this time she did not intend to bury herself again. She walked up to the small rise behind the house, before she began her chores that morning, the way she had taken to doing more often since the shooting, and stood a while at Ezra's grave with the cold wind pulling at her skirt. She had never been much for talking to the dead. Her father hadn't raised her that way. He'd always said, a grave was for the living to grieve at, not for the dead to listen from. and that a person who needed to believe otherwise usually needed the comfort more than the truth. But she found herself talking anyway some mornings, because the talking helped settle something in her chest that nothing else quite reached. "I should have told you," she said. "Long before now. Maybe if I had, you'd have known to watch for the wrong kind of rider on that trail." The wind didn't answer. It never did. "I'm going to find out what happened to you," she went on. "Whatever it costs. I owe you that much. And I owe your brother that much. And I think, somewhere under all of it, I owe myself that much too." She stood there a moment longer, watching the sun climb fully over the ridge, throwing long gold light across the wooden marker and the small stones she'd gathered to weigh down its base against the wind. Then she turned back toward the house, because there was still work to be done, and grief, whatever else it was, had never once excused a woman from the chores waiting on her. 2 miles east, in his own small house, Amos sat at his kitchen table that same morning with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of him, turning over in his mind everything Odessa hadn't quite said. He had lost his brother a year ago, and spent every day since telling himself the loss was simple, an accident, a bad trail, a horse that spooked at the wrong moment in the wrong light. Simple grief was hard enough to carry. He was only now understanding that he had never actually been carrying the simple kind at all, only a story he'd agreed to believe, because the alternative asked more of him than he'd been ready to give. He thought of Ezra as a boy, chasing him barefoot across summer grass. Their mother always scolded them for ruining, back before either of them had learned the particular weight that came with being a man responsible for land, for family, for the safety of people you loved in a country that did not always extend safety generously. He had not told Odessa everything he remembered from that morning on the ridge, had told her about the two riders, the species, the dust cloud, the strange unease that had sat with him for a year without a name to put to it. He had not told her about the hoof prints below the wash, the ones the sheriff's inexperienced young deputy had glanced over and dismissed as belonging to Ezra's own horse before it spooked Prince. Amos had looked at himself, the day after the funeral, in a private grief-numbed hour when no one else was watching, and something about their depth and their spacing had struck him as wrong even then, though he hadn't had the language yet to say exactly how. A spooked horse ran wild, panicked, its stride long and uneven. Those prints had been steady, deliberate, the prints of an animal being walked, carefully, alongside a trail its rider had no intention of leaving to chance. He had told himself, for a year, that grief was inventing patterns where none existed. He was no longer certain that was all it had been. "I should have said something sooner," he said quietly, to the empty kitchen, to his brother's memory. "Should have pushed harder, asked more." The house didn't answer him either, but he sat with the silence a while longer anyway, and when he finally rose to start his own day's work, something in his face had settled into a decision he had not quite let himself make out loud until that moment. He would help her. Whatever she was hiding, whatever the truth about Ezra's death turned out to be, whatever men were riding toward that quiet stretch of land with reasons Amos could not yet begin to guess, and he would not let his brother's widow face the reckoning alone, the way she had apparently been facing everything alone for far longer than any of them had understood. Family was not only the people who shared your blood. Ezra had taught him that, in his own quiet way, the day he brought home a stage-line stranger with careful hands and watchful eyes and called her, without a moment's hesitation, his wife. Amos meant to honor that now, whatever it cost him. Deadman Wash looked smaller in daylight than it did in memory. That was the first thing Odessa noticed, riding down into it at dawn with her father's revolver on her hip and a year's worth of avoided grief sitting hard in her chest. Smaller. Just a shallow cut of red rock and dry grass, the trail narrowing where it dropped toward the creek bed. Nothing about it that should have been able to kill a man who'd ridden it 100 times before, except it had. She dismounted slow, walked the trail on foot, the way her father taught her to walk any ground that mattered. Eyes low, reading dirt instead of sky, because dirt didn't lie. Sky did. Sometimes clouds promised rain that never came. Light played tricks at dusk, but dirt only ever told you exactly what had happened on it, if you knew how to ask. She found the place where Ezra had gone down. A hollow in the brush, grown back over now. A year of seasons trying their patient best to erase what had happened here. She crouched anyway, ran her fingers through the dirt the way she used to run them through gunpowder residue on a stagecoach floor. Checking, always checking. Because checking was the only thing that had ever kept her alive. A boot print, half buried. Not Ezra's too small, too square-heeled, the kind of boot a working gun hand wore instead of a rancher. Which meant someone else had been standing here. Which meant Amos was right. Which meant she had spent a full year burying a man beside a lie she'd told herself because the truth was too heavy to lift alone. She sat back on her heels in the dirt, and for one long, unguarded moment, she let herself feel it. All of it. Not the trained stillness her father built into her. Not the flat readiness of a woman who counted exits before she counted anything else. Just grief, plain and total. The kind she hadn't let herself have at the funeral, because there had been too many eyes on her. Too many questions she wasn't ready to answer, until a voice behind her said, quiet and unhurried, "Ma'am, you dropped something." She was up and turned with the revolver clear of leather before the man had finished his sentence. He didn't flinch. That was the first thing she noticed about him. Didn't raise his hands, didn't step back, didn't do any of the small, frightened things men did when a gun came up on them fast. He just stood there, 30 feet off, a battered saddlebag over one shoulder, and let her look at him the way a man lets a dog decide, on its own time, whether or not it means to bite. "Easy," he said. "I'm not armed, not drawn anyhow." "That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed, "it's not." She kept the gun leveled, studied him, middle-aged, dust-worn, the kind of face that had spent a long career learning to give away nothing it didn't choose to. "You following me?" "I was following the wash." He nodded toward the ground between them. "Same as you, seems like. Though I expect we're looking for different things. State your business." "Name's Garrett Voss." He said it plain, no hedge in it, which struck her as either very foolish or very deliberate. "And my business, ma'am, is you." The words landed like a dropped stone, because there it was. The thing she'd been bracing for, since a brass token turned up in her dirt. Not a rumor anymore, not a fear at 3 in the morning. A man, standing in front of her, saying it plain. "I don't know you," she said. "No." He held very still. "But I know you, Cimarron." Her finger found the trigger guard, because that name had not been spoken out loud to her in 8 years, not by anyone, not even in her own head most days. And hearing it now from a stranger's mouth in the exact hollow where her husband had died felt like a hand closing around her throat. "Say that again," she said. "Quiet, dangerous quiet. I don't need to. You heard it fine. Who sent you?" "Man named Coil." Her breath went short. "Which no, steady." Her father's voice rising fast underneath the panic. "Still as water, Odessa. Even now. Especially now." "Then you already know," she said. "What happens to men Coil sends." "I know what happened to 3 of Coburn's boys." Voss's voice stayed level, almost gentle, which somehow unsettled her more than a threat would have. "I know it wasn't cruelty. 3 shots, 3 wounds, nobody dead who didn't have to be. That's not how a killer shoots, ma'am. That's how somebody shoots, who's spent her whole life trying not to be one. You don't know anything about me. I know you never fired first. Not on that stage. Not here." He nodded slow, toward the ground, toward the boot print she'd been crouched over, "which is more, I expect, than Coil's willing to admit to himself, which is why I came ahead of him, to see the truth of it myself before I decided what I meant to do about it." "You're here to collect," she said. "Say it plain." "I'm here," he said, "because a man offered me money to find a ghost, and I found a widow instead. Those aren't different people. Maybe not to him." Voss set the saddlebag down slow, both hands visible the whole time. An old habit of a man who'd learned the hard way what fast movements cost him around frightened people holding guns. "But I've hunted a lot of names in my life, ma'am. Learned to tell early on which ones deserved what was coming and which ones just got unlucky once and never got to stop paying for it. Which one am I? Haven't decided yet." His eyes didn't leave hers. "That's why I'm talking instead of drawing." The gun did not lower. Not yet. But something in her arm had gone from rigid to merely ready, which was, for Odessa Marsh in that particular moment, close enough to trust that it frightened her almost as much as the gun had a minute before. "Talk then," she said. Fast. He told her about Dell. Told it plain. No dressing on it. The way a man tells a story he's turned over too many times to bother softening it anymore. A boy of 23. First real job with a hard outfit. A jammed rifle on a stagecoach robbery that should never have happened. A revolver that never cleared leather. A mother who asked after him in every letter until the asking finally stopped because she'd died still. Waiting for an answer nobody ever brought her. He drew on me, Odessa said, when the silence stretched too long to hold. He wasn't fast enough. I didn't want. She stopped herself because she had never said this part out loud. Not to Ezra. Not to Amos. Not even fully to herself most nights, when the memory rose up uninvited and she pushed it back down before it could finish arriving. I hesitated, she said finally. Half a second. Because he looked young. Because I thought he might run instead. He didn't run. No. And you kept your promise anyway. She looked at him sharp. What promise? Whatever your daddy taught you a gun was for. Voss said it quiet, almost gentle. I've met men trained the same way, time to time. Not many, but enough to know the shape of it when I see it standing in front of me. She lowered the gun. Not all the way. Not trust. Not yet, just enough to signal that the next several minutes were not, for the moment, going to end in gunfire. Why come find me first? She asked. Before Coil. Because Coil's not thinking straight anymore. 8 years of grief will do that to a man. Voss's jaw tightened, just slightly. He used to be careful, patient. Now he's angry, and angry men make angry decisions, and angry decisions get people killed who don't deserve it. People like me. People like your husband. The words landed harder than she expected, even though some cold, waiting part of her had already guessed at their shape before he said them. Say it plain, she said. Her voice had gone very quiet. About a year back, Coil had a lead on you. Sent 2 men out this way to look around, quiet-like, just to see if the whisper had legs. Boss's eyes did not leave hers. One of them came back saying the lead had gone cold. Wouldn't say much more than that. Coil let it drop. Now, I'm wondering if it went cold because the man who chased it found something he never meant to find and never had the stomach to report what he'd done about it. Deadman Wash. I'd guess so. Yes. The ground seemed to tilt under her, though she did not move, did not fall. Only stood very still in the exact hollow where her husband had died and let a stranger's words rearrange an entire year of grief into something else entirely. Because it made sense. Because Ezra had ridden this trail 100 times without trouble, and the 101st time 2 strange riders had been on the ridge above him, according to his own brother, and a boot print too square-heeled for a rancher's foot sat half buried in the dirt exactly where Ezra had gone down. Because he must have seen them. Must have ridden up on something he wasn't meant to see, asked a question he wasn't meant to ask, and paid for it with his life, while she stood 12 miles away hanging laundry. Believing because believing was easier that the world had simply taken him by accident. It hadn't. It had taken him because of her. I didn't know, she said, and her voice broke on the last word. Finally, after a year of holding it steady through everything, I didn't know they were even looking. I thought I was safe here. I thought she stopped, because there was no ending to that sentence that didn't hurt worse than the silence. You thought wrong, Voss said. Not cruel, just honest. Same as I've thought wrong plenty of times myself, chasing names I shouldn't have chased for men who didn't deserve the chasing. She turned away from him, faced the wash, the hollow, the place where her husband's whole life had ended on a trail he trusted, and pressed both hands flat against her thighs, the way her father taught her, until the shaking stopped. So what happens now, she said, without turning back around. Now, Voss said, you've got a choice to make, and so do I. What's yours? Whether I ride back to Coil and tell him I found nothing. He said it slow, weighing each word before he let it go. Or whether I ride back and tell him the truth and let whatever comes next come. And if you tell him the truth, then he comes himself. Not hired men. Him. Voss's voice went flat and grim. A man riding 8 years of grief doesn't stop for reason, ma'am. Doesn't stop for mercy either. Not anymore. Not from what I've watched happen to him these past few months. She turned back to face him. Then don't tell him. I won't. He met her eyes steady. But that only buys you time, Cimarron. Not safety. He'll come regardless. Sooner or later, a man like that doesn't let a debt like this stay unpaid forever. Whether I feed him the trail or somebody else does. Why are you helping me? She asked. You could collect. Could ride back right now. Tell him exactly where I am and be done with it. Voss picked his saddlebag back up. Slung it over one shoulder, slow, unhurried. A man giving himself time to find the honest answer instead of the easy one. Because I spent weeks chasing a killer, he said finally, and I found a widow standing over her husband's grave instead, asking the same question I've been asking my whole miserable career, and never once gotten a clean answer to. Which question? Whether the debt a person owes for surviving, he said, is the same size as the debt they'd owe for choosing to kill. He shook his head slowly. I don't think it is, not anymore. Used to. Don't now. They stood a long moment in the growing daylight, two strangers bound suddenly by a year-old grave and 8 years of somebody else's grief. And Odessa found herself studying his face the way her father taught her to study any man whose next move might matter. She did not see a killer. She saw instead something closer to a man who had spent a very long time doing work he no longer fully believed in, and had finally, standing in a dry Arizona wash at sunrise, found a reason to stop. There's a man in town, she said slowly. Amos. My husband's brother. He suspects something already. If I bring him what you've told me, careful who you trust with this. Voss's voice sharpened, just slightly. Not because of him. Because word travels faster than any of us mean it to, and Coil's got more ears out this way than either of us have counted yet. I trust Amos. Then trust him quiet. Voss held her gaze. Because the moment Coil hears his brother's killer is a woman with a name and a face and a husband's grave to avenge for herself, that's the moment this stops being a hunt and starts being a war. And wars like that don't ask who deserves to be standing in the middle of them when the shooting starts. She rode back to the ranch alone, Voss peeling off toward town with a promise fragile, unproven, the kind of promise she had no real reason to trust from a stranger except that something in her father's old training, the part that read a man's stillness better than his words, told her it was worth the risk. Amos was waiting in her yard. When she arrived, his horse lathered from a hard ride, his face carrying an urgency that told her, before he said a single word, that the day was about to grow considerably more complicated. There's a man in town, he said, asking questions about you. Different one, not the fella who checked into the mercantile room. This one rode in an hour ago, alone, hasn't said his business to anybody. Just been watching the road out this way like he's waiting on something. Her stomach went cold. Describe him, big man, gray in the beard. Sat his horse like he's used to being obeyed. Amos's jaw tightened. Didn't like the look of him, Odessa. Not one bit. She thought of Coil's face, the one she'd never actually seen but had built anyway, piece by piece out of a brass token and 8 years of silence, and a dead boy's revolver never clearing leather. That's not one of Coil's men, she said quietly. How do you know? She looked past Amos, toward the road, toward town, toward a reckoning that had apparently decided not to wait for Garrett Voss's careful timeline after all. Because that's Coil himself, she said, and he's not asking questions to find me anymore. Then what's he doing? Odessa reached down and checked her father's revolver, slow and steady, the old stillness rising up in her exactly the way it had risen every single time it mattered, across 20 years of careful, patient training. He's letting me know, she said, that he already has. The wind shifted that afternoon, pulling in cooler air from the north, and Odessa stood in her yard watching the empty road toward town with a clarity that had been building in her for a full week. Ever since 3 careless riders mistook a quiet woman for an easy target and learned, in 4 short seconds, exactly how wrong a man could be about the person standing in front of him. She had spent years hiding from a debt she owed for surviving something no 19-year-old should ever have had to survive alone. She had spent a year grieving a husband whose death she'd been too afraid to properly question. Both of those women, the hiding one and the grieving one, stood somewhere behind her now, because the woman's standing in the yard today had run out of places left to hide and had decided, somewhere between a dry wash at dawn and a stranger's careful honesty, that she was done running anyway. Amos, she said without turning, I need you to do something for me, and I need you not to argue. What? Ride to the marshal. Tell him what you told me, the man in town, the description. And then I need you to go home and stay there and let me handle whatever's coming next. Odessa, please. Her voice cracked just once on the single word. I already lost your brother to something I didn't see coming in time. I won't lose you the same way. That's not your decision to make for me. Amos, no. He stepped closer, his voice low and fierce in a way she hadn't heard from him before. Not once in a full year of shared grief. Ezra was my brother before he was your husband. Whatever's coming for you today, It's coming for his memory too, and I have got just as much right to stand for that as you do." She looked at him a long moment, something in her chest tightening at the stubborn set of his jaw, so much like his brother's. It nearly undid her composure entirely. "If it comes to shooting," she said quietly, "I need you clear of it. Not because I doubt you. Because I already buried one man I loved this year, and I don't have the strength left to bury another." That finally reached him. He held her gaze a long moment, jaw working, some old grief and older love, passing silent between them. Then, slowly, he nodded. Not agreement, not entirely, but something close enough to trust that it would have to serve for now. "I'll ride to the Marshal," he said. "But I'm not going home after. I'll be close. Close enough to come if you need me." "And much," he said. Already turning for his horse isn't a request. He rode for town, and Odessa stood alone in her yard as the afternoon light began its long, slow slide. Toward evening, her father's gun steady on her hip, a debt 8 years unpaid, finally, undeniably, arriving at her door. Barnaby Coil had ridden into town an hour before noon, and he had not gone looking for Odessa Marsh directly, because 8 years of patient hunting had taught him a slower, more deliberate kind of arrival, the kind that let a place come to him, instead of the other way around. He took a seat at the corner table of the saloon, ordered coffee instead of whiskey, and let the town talk. It did not disappoint him. Silas Marsh's girl, an old cattleman, was saying at the bar, the same conversation Coil had heard, in one form or another, in every town he'd passed through this past week, the story traveling faster than he was, growing a little each time it changed hands. Trained her from a child. Man like that, he don't do that for sport. Coil turned his coffee cup slowly on the table, listening, watching the room the way he'd watched 100 rooms before it, cataloging faces, exits, the particular rhythm of a place that did not yet know. Violence was already sitting quiet among them. He had pictured this moment for 8 years. Had built it and rebuilt it across 100 sleepless nights. The moment he would finally stand across from the person who took Dell from him. The moment 8 years of grief would finally have somewhere honest to go. He had imagined rage. Had imagined, more than once, satisfaction. Sitting in the corner of a nothing saloon in a nothing Arizona town, he found himself feeling neither. He felt instead something closer to exhaustion, the particular bone-deep tiredness of a man who has carried a weight so long he has forgotten what his own shoulders felt like before it settled there. Because Dell had been reckless. Coil had known that even then, 8 years ago, had warned him more than once against riding with an outfit too hungry and too careless to keep a green boy safe. He had buried that knowledge alongside his brother, because grief did not leave much room for honest accounting, and anger was easier to carry than guilt. He was not sure, sitting in that corner now, which one he'd actually been carrying all this time. Garrett Voss found him there an hour later. He'd ridden hard from the wash, turning the whole encounter over in his mind the entire way, weighing what he owed Coil against what he now believed he owed a widow standing over a year-old grave, and by the time he pushed through the saloon door, he had not yet fully decided which debt he intended to honor. Coil looked up before Voss reached the table. "You found something. Found a woman living quiet on a ranch 12 miles out," Voss said carefully, sitting without being asked. "You're lying to me, Voss." The words landed flat, certain, no heat in them at all, which unsettled Voss more than anger would have, because a calm accusation from a man like Coil usually meant the accusation had already been confirmed some other way. "I've been doing this a long time," Coil went on, quiet, "long enough to know the shape of a man dancing around a truth he doesn't want to hand over." He set his coffee down. "So I'll ask you once plain. Is it her?" Voss held his gaze a long moment. He thought of the wash, of a woman's hands pressed flat against her thighs until the shaking stopped, the exact stillness of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to survive grief instead of surrendering to it. He thought of a boy named Dell, 23 years old, a jammed rifle, a revolver that never cleared leather. "It's her," Voss said finally. "But before you ride out there, Coil, I need you to hear something first. I'm not interested in hearing anything that slows me down. You're going to hear it anyway." Voss's voice hardened, just slightly. "Because the woman you're riding toward didn't hunt Dell down. He drew on a moving stagecoach, jammed rifle, went for his revolver instead of running when he had the chance. She hesitated before she fired. I've talked to enough people on that old stage line to know that much for certain. Coil's jaw tightened. You think that changes anything? I think it should. He was 23 years old. I know. He was reckless and green, and he shouldn't have been on that job at all. And I told him so a dozen times before it killed him. Coil's voice, for the first time, cracked just slightly, just enough to reveal the 8 years of grief still raw beneath the calm. You think I don't know all that already, Voss? You think I haven't spent every single night since burying him wondering whether the anger I've been carrying all this time was ever really about her at all? The saloon had gone quiet around their table. Then let it go, Voss said quietly. Ride home. Bury the debt where it belongs with him, and let the woman raise her husband's memory in peace. I can't, Coil said finally. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I promise you this much. Voss, whatever happens when I ride out there, it won't be the massacre you're afraid of. I came for an answer, not a slaughter. He rose from the table, and something in his face had shifted, not softened exactly, but settled, the way a man settles once a question he's carried too long finally starts, however painfully, to resolve itself. Saddle up, he said. I'm riding out there today, and you're riding with me, whether you like it or not, because I need one honest man standing beside me when I finally get my answer. Word of Coil's intentions reached the Marsh ranch before the man himself did, carried on a borrowed horse by a boy from the mercantile Voss had paid, quietly, to ride ahead with a message too important to risk in Coil's own hearing. Odessa read the note twice in the fading afternoon light. He's riding out today. Says he wants an answer, not a war. I believe him, but be ready regardless. V. She folded the paper slowly and looked out toward the road where the dust of an approaching rider, one rider, unhurried, in no apparent need of surprise, had just begun to rise against the darkening sky. She thought of her father's voice, steady as ever across 20 years, and one grave, the same old lesson rising up in her now the way it always did when the moment called for it. She had kept that promise once on a stagecoach, at the cost of a young man's life and 8 years of another man's grief. She intended to keep it again today, whatever the cost turned out to be, not by drawing first, and not by running, but by standing exactly where she was, still as water, and finally, after a year of silence, giving Barnaby Coil the honest answer he had ridden 200 miles to find. The dust on the road grew closer. One rider. Steady pace. No hurry in it at all, which frightened her more than urgency would have, because a man in no hurry was a man who had already decided how the conversation was going to end and saw no reason to rush toward it. She thought of Ezra, buried on the rise behind her. Thought of her father, buried in Kansas dirt, 20 years gone. Thought of Del Coil, 23 years old, a jammed rifle and an unfired revolver, and the half-second of hesitation that had cost him his life, and given her, in exchange, 8 years of borrowed peace. She was only now beginning to understand, had never truly been free. The rider crested the last rise before the ranch, and for the first time she saw him whole, broad-shouldered, gray-bearded, sitting his horse, with the particular stillness of a man who had spent a very long time learning to carry grief without letting it show. Barnaby Coil had finally come to collect his answer, and Odessa, standing in the fading gold light with her father's gun steady on her hip and her husband's grave at her back, understood that whatever happened in the next few minutes would decide far more than her own fate. It would decide whether 8 years of grief could finally at long last be laid to rest, or whether it was about to claim one more life before it was through. She did not move, did not reach for the gun, only stood, waiting, the way she had waited her whole life, for this exact reckoning to finally arrive. Ahead of her, Coil brought his horse down the last stretch of road, at an unhurried walk, his hands visible, his rifle still in its scabbard. A man who had ridden 200 miles carrying a question he was no longer entirely certain he wanted answered. Neither of them spoke yet. Neither of them needed to. The silence between them stretched taut as a wire, 8 years and one dead boy and one dead husband, all balanced somewhere inside it, waiting to see which way it would finally break. He stopped his horse 30 feet out. Same distance the first riders had stopped, a week ago, before 3 careless men learned exactly how wrong they'd been about her. Barnaby Coil did not reach for anything. He just sat there, looking at her across that 30 feet of hard-packed yard, and for a long moment neither of them said a word, because 8 years does not condense easily into a sentence, and both of them seemed to understand that whatever came next would matter more than almost anything either of them had said in all that time. "You know why I'm here," he said finally. "I do." "Then say his name." Her jaw tightened. "Dell." "Say it again." "Dell Coil." Her voice held steady, though it cost her something to keep it that way. 23 years old. Jammed rifle. Went for his revolver instead of running. You could have let him run. He didn't give me the chance to find out if he would. Coil dismounted slow, boots hitting the dirt with none of the careless swagger the first riders had carried into this same yard. He walked closer, one measured step at a time, and she watched his hands the whole way, not out of fear exactly, but out of the old habit her father built into her, the habit that had never once failed to keep her breathing. "I buried my mother 2 years after him," he said. "Never stopped asking after you. Not once. Right up until the day she went into the ground, still not knowing your name. I'm sorry. Sorry don't put her back." "No." Odessa held his gaze, unflinching. "It doesn't. Nothing does. I know that better than most people, Mr. Coil. I buried my own husband a year ago, and I'm still waiting on the sorry that puts him back too." That landed. She watched it. Land watched something shift behind his eyes, some old certainty cracking loose from a foundation 8 years deep, because she remembered Dell's face. Had never once stopped remembering it, no matter how many years she'd spent, trying to fold it away beneath a floorboard, alongside everything else. The jammed rifle. The half-second where she'd hoped, he might simply turn and run instead, which he hadn't, which meant the choice that followed had never really been a choice at all by the time it arrived. Only a promise finishing itself the only way a promise like that could finish. "I think about him," she said quietly, before she'd fully decided to say it at all. "More than you'd guess. Not every day anymore. But enough. Don't need your pity." "It's not pity." Her voice caught, just slightly, and she let it. "It's the truth, Mr. Coil. Same as everything else I owe you today. Your husband," he said slowly, "killed by 2 men scouting this land for you," she said. "About a year back. My husband must have ridden up on something he wasn't meant to see." Her voice did not waver, though the words cost her everything she had left. "So before you ask me to answer for Dell, Mr. Coil, I'd ask you to answer for Ezra. Because it seems to me we're both carrying the same grief, dressed up in 2 different names." Coil went very still, because he hadn't known. She could see that plain on his face, the particular, sickening stillness of a man discovering that his own hunger for an answer had cost more than he ever intended it to. "I never ordered that," he said. "I believe you." And she did, somehow, though believing it cost her something too. "But you sent them anyway. Same as I fired that shotgun 8 years back, without meaning for it to cost a mother her son." The silence between them stretched long and taut. 2 grievers, standing in a dusty yard with a debt between them too large for either one to settle alone. "So what happens now?" she said. "You still came to collect." "I came," Coyle said, slowly, for an answer. "I told Voss that plain, and I meant it." He looked at her a long moment, something in his face settling into a decision that had clearly been building the entire 200-mile ride. "I got it. Whatever comes after, that's still being decided." That was when the dust rose behind him. Not 1 rider this time. 6, maybe 7, moving hard and fast along the same ridgeline. The first 3 had come down a week ago, and Coyle's head snapped toward it before Odessa's did, his whole body going rigid in a way that told her, instantly, this was not part of whatever plan he'd ridden in with. "That's not," he stopped, swore under his breath. "That's Garner." "Who's Garner?" "Man I left in charge of the crew. Told him to hold 2 miles back till I sent word." Coyle's jaw had gone hard as stone. He never did trust I'd come out here and just talk. Because Garner had watched Coyle change these past weeks, watched the anger that used to burn clean and simple in him start bending sideways into something Garner didn't have a name for and didn't much care to understand, which meant Garner had made his own decision instead, which meant 7 armed men were coming down that ridge with an agenda that had nothing to do with answers at all. "How many with him?" Odessa asked, already checking her father's revolver, already feeling the old stillness rise up, fast and total. Exactly the way it had a week ago at this same clothesline. 6 of mine. Coyle's hand had gone, without seeming to notice it himself, toward his own gun belt. And unless I miss my guess, he didn't finish. He didn't have to. Because riding at the edge of that group, unmistakable, even at this distance, in his fine gray coat and his wounded pride still raw as an open sore, rode Elias Coburn. "There's more you should know," Coil said. Fast now, the words coming clipped and urgent. "Garner didn't like my terms from the start. Told him plain, if you find her, we talk. We don't burn a whole territory down to get there." "What does that mean?" "Means he had his own plan, in case mine went soft on him. Word reached me 2 nights back. Garner sent a rider toward the San Carlos boundary, asking after which families lived closest to yours, which ones he could lean on if he needed leverage to draw you out." The blood went cold in her veins, because that was not a threat aimed at her alone anymore. That was Amos's neighbors. That was families who had welcomed Ezra's wife into their circle simply because Ezra had loved her, who owed no debt at all to a dead boy on a stagecoach, 8 years gone, and would pay one anyway if Garner decided they were useful. "You should have told me that first," she said, low and furious. "I'm telling you now." Coil's jaw was tight. "And I'm telling you, I already sent word back, telling him to stand down." Whether he listened, the dust on the ridge answered that question before he finished the sentence. "He must have caught wind you were out here," Odessa said, fast, her mind already working the way her father trained her to work it, counting distances, counting cover, counting the thin seconds she had left before the ground. Beneath this whole reckoning shifted into something far bloodier than either of them had come, intending. "Threw in with your man rather than let another crack at me slip past him. 2 grudges, Coil said grimly, riding the same horse. "Which makes 7 guns instead of 1 conversation. I didn't want this." "I believe that, too." She was already moving, pulling him by the sleeve toward the low stone wall beside the well. The same stone lip she'd marked as cover the very first day, weeks ago, when 3 careless riders had ridden down, thinking her nothing more than an easy target, but wanting something and getting it. "We're never the same animal out here, Mr. Coil. You should know that better than almost anybody alive." The house door slammed open behind them. Amos, breathless, a rifle already in his hands, he'd never made it back to town at all, she realized in one fast, cold understanding, had circled back the moment he saw dust on the ridge, had chosen his brother's widow over his own promised safety without a second's hesitation. "Odessa, I see them." She was already reloading, her hands steady despite everything. Despite the 7 riders closing fast, despite a year of grief and a week of unearthed truth, all converging at once into this single narrowing afternoon. "Get behind the wall. Now." "What about him?" Amos's rifle swung toward Coil, suspicion flaring hot and immediate. "He's not the one you need to worry about." Odessa's voice cracked like a whip, cutting through the fear in the yard. "Not today." Coil met Amos's eyes for one long, charged second. "She's right," he said. "Whatever you think of me, boy, today I'm aiming the same direction you are." Which left no more time for talking. Because Garner's riders had crested the last rise, and Garner himself, lean, hard-eyed, a man who had spent his whole outlaw life believing that mercy was simply weakness, wearing a gentler name, raised one hand, and the riders below him spread wide across the yard's approach, and the first shot cracked out across the afternoon before anyone had said another word at all. It caught the stone wall an inch from Odessa's shoulder, spraying grit and chips of rock, and every careful, patient lesson her father ever taught her rose up in her all at once, fast and total and absolute. Elbow locked. Not stiff. Locked. She rose from cover and fired. One man went down before he'd cleared his second shot. She dropped behind the wall again, breathing controlled, counting, because counting was the only thing standing between a woman and panic in a moment like this. And panic got people killed faster than any bullet ever could. Beside her, Coil had drawn too, and for one strange, suspended heartbeat, she found herself fighting alongside the very man who had ridden 200 miles to end her, both of them now aimed at the enemy, both of them discovering, in the worst possible moment, that grief could apparently turn into something else entirely if it was given enough reason to. "Garner!" Coil's voice tore across the yard, raw and furious. "Stand down! This ain't what I—" Garner's answer was another volley of gunfire. Because some debts, Garner had clearly decided somewhere on that 2-mile ride, did not get settled with conversation. Because he had followed Coil for 8 years, chasing exactly this reckoning, and he was not about to let a change of heart rob him of it now. Dust everywhere. Horses screaming. A rider went down near the barn, his mount bolting riderless toward the ridge. Another swung wide around the well, trying to flank the wall, and Odessa caught him in the shoulder before he'd covered 10 feet. Not a kill shot. Never a kill shot. Not unless there was no other honest choice left, which in the next second there wasn't. He raised his revolver anyway, and her second shot finished what Mercy had tried and failed to prevent, because that was the arithmetic of it now. Because every hesitation cost something, and every mercy carried its own risk, and somewhere underneath the noise and the smoke her father's voice kept rising, steady as ever, elbow locked. Count your shots. Still as water, even now, especially now. Coburn's men hired guns, not believers, men who'd signed on for a payday, and not a war, began peeling off within the first minute, wheeling their horses for the ridge the moment the fight turned honest instead of easy. That left Garner's corps, 4 men who'd ridden with him long enough to trust his fury over their own sense, and those 4 did not break so easily. The fight that followed did not last long. It only felt long, the way violence always does, to the people caught inside it, each second stretching wide and strange, sound and motion both slowing and rushing at once, until afterward none of them could have said with any certainty whether it had taken 2 minutes or 20. Amos fired from behind the wall's north edge, steady despite his hands shaking, dropping one rider from his saddle with a shot that would have made his brother proud, had Ezra lived to see the man his little brother had quietly become. Voss arrived at a dead gallop from the road, just as the fighting peaked, throwing himself from his still-moving horse and rolling into cover beside them, his own revolver already speaking before he'd fully found his feet. "Told you I'd be close," he shouted, answering a question nobody had time to ask. Coburn, for his part, proved exactly the kind of man his own reputation had always suggested underneath the fine coat, and the careful manners brave enough to send other men into danger, considerably less brave once the danger turned around and came looking for him directly. He wheeled his horse the moment the numbers shifted, spurring hard for the ridge, abandoning the fight he'd ridden into with such confidence 20 minutes before. He did not get far. Marshal Bragg's rifle caught him from the tree line above the trail, Bragg having ridden out himself the moment Amos's earlier warning reached him in town, arriving just late enough to miss the fight's opening and just in time to close its final chapter. And Elias Coburn tumbled from his horse into the dirt of the very road his hired men had ridden down a week before, wounded, cursing, and very much finished. Garner held out longest. He had fought his way nearly to the porch itself, driven by something colder and more absolute than the others carried, and it was Coil, finally, who stood between him and Odessa in the last ragged seconds of the fight. Coil, who had ridden 200 miles seeking her death, now placing his own body squarely in the path of the man who'd come to finish what he himself no longer had the stomach for. "Get out of my way," Garner snarled. "No. She killed your brother, Coil. And I decided," Barnaby Coil said, quiet even now, even with gunfire still ringing fresh in his ears and blood his own, she would realize a half-second later, already soaking dark through his shirt from a wound, taken somewhere in the fighting's chaos, already staining the ground beneath him, that I'm done letting his death decide who else gets to die on account of it. Garner fired. Coil did not fall right away. He absorbed it standing, the way a man absorbs a truth he has already, somewhere in his heart, accepted the cost of, and in the half-second before Garner could fire again, Odessa's own shot found him first, clean and final, the same steady discipline that had put down 3 careless men a week ago, now closing the account on the 7th and last. The yard went silent. She caught Coil as he went down, the way she had once caught wounded strangers on a stagecoach floor, with no name for either of them beyond the job in front of her, and she pressed her hand hard against the wound in his side, though some old, honest part of her already understood it would not be enough. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Reckon I did." His voice had gone thin, but something in his face, something that had not been there when he first rode down off that ridge 200 miles and 8 years ago, had settled, finally, into something close to peace. "Owed somebody a debt too, I expect. Just took me 8 years to figure out who I actually owed it to." "Coil, tell my mother's grave," he said, and his eyes had begun to lose their focus, drifting towards some middle distance she could not follow him into, that Dell got his answer. "Ain't the one I rode out here planning on, but it's the true one." He did not speak again. Odessa knelt in the dust of her own yard, the same dust where 3 careless men had learned a week ago exactly what she was capable of, and held the hand of the man who had spent 8 years hunting her, until, at the very last, he chose something braver than the hunt had ever asked of him. For a long while afterward, nobody in the yard said anything at all. Amos lowered his rifle slowly, his hands still shaking with the aftermath of it, and looked around at the scattered dead and wounded with the particular numbness of a man who had never expected, when he woke that morning, to end the day, having fought a battle in his brother's memory. Voss stood at the wall's edge, reloading out of habit, more than necessity, his eyes distant, already turning the whole strange reckoning over in his mind the way he turned over every job, once the shooting stopped. "It's done," Amos said finally, quiet, disbelieving. "Isn't it? Actually done." "It's done," Odessa said, though her voice carried none of the relief the words should have brought with them, only exhaustion and grief, and something that might, in time, become peace, once she'd had enough distance to recognize it. She looked down at Coil's still face one last time before she rose. "Help me carry him inside," she said. "He deserves better than lying out here in the dirt till the marshal comes." Amos hesitated only a moment before he knelt to help her. Some reckonings, she understood, did not end cleanly. This one hadn't, but it had ended honestly, every hidden truth finally standing in the open air where it belonged. And for the first time in a long while, honest felt like enough. The marshal's office in town processed the aftermath over the following days, with the slow, careful thoroughness of a case that had, almost overnight, grown far larger than anyone had first understood. Voss produced the documents he'd carried the entire time, quiet insurance against exactly this kind of reckoning records copied from Elton Dobbs's own federal files, proof in the registrar's own hand that he had sold confidential stage line information for cash on more than one occasion, each sale tracing a widening circle of harm that had, at its center, cost one good man his life on a trail he trusted. Marshal Bragg read the documents twice, his tired face going harder with each page. "This'll reach the territorial office inside the week," he told Odessa. Standing in her yard 3 days after the fighting, the wounded already carted off to face whatever justice remained waiting for men like Coburn and the surviving members of Garner's crew. "Dobbs'll answer for it. Every bit of it, the bribes, your husband's death, all of it laid plain for the record. And Coil?" Bragg was quiet a moment. "Man rode 200 miles to kill you," he said finally, "and died instead putting himself between you and a bullet meant for your back. I expect the record ought to reflect that too, ma'am. However complicated the whole of it turns out to read. And Coburn? Territorial judge'll see him inside the month. Attempted land seizure by force, conspiracy, more charges than I've got fingers to count on." Bragg's mouth twisted, something close to grim satisfaction in it. "Man's fine coat won't buy him out of this one, ma'am. Not with 3 separate witnesses, a written confession from one of his surviving hands, and a marshal who watched Tim run from his own fight with his own eyes. Good. Didn't figure you'd argue the point." 300 miles east, in the same cramped government office that smelled of dust and old paper, 2 federal marshals arrived for Elton Dobbs. On a gray Tuesday morning, the territorial office's telegram having reached them 2 days before, with instructions plain enough to leave no room for delay, he did not resist. He simply sat very still at his desk, the locked drawer already emptied of whatever remained in it, and stared at the documents laid out before him with the particular numbness of a small man, finally confronted with the true size of what his smallness had cost other people. "There was a rancher," one of the marshals said, reading from Voss's copied records. "You sold the information that got him killed." Dobbs did not answer for a long moment. "I didn't know," he said finally, and his voice carried none of the conviction he clearly wished it did. "I told myself it was only paperwork. Old records changing hands. Man's dead regardless of what you told yourself. They let him out in irons, past clerks who would not meet his eyes, and Elton Dobbs walked into whatever reckoning waited for him with the slow, defeated steps of a man who had spent years believing some doors were better left unopened by the person who'd sold the key, only to discover, at the very end, that the door opened anyway, and that it opened on him. They buried Barnaby Coil on the rise behind the house, a respectful distance from Ezra's grave, because Odessa had decided, turning the question over for a long, quiet evening before she reached it, that a man who spent 8 years chasing grief and chose in his final seconds, to spend it protecting a stranger's life instead, had earned at least that much peace. Amos stood beside her at the small ceremony, his rifle finally set aside, his suspicion of the past week folded now into something closer to grim, hard-won understanding. Ezra would have wanted this, he said quietly, watching the last shovelful of dirt settle. The truth lay out plain. Even the ugly parts of it. He would have. You going to keep the name now? Cimarron? Odessa considered the question a long moment, looking out over the land that had been, for years, her fragile borrowed piece, and would now, she understood, have to become something sturdier than that. A piece built honestly on truth instead of silence. No, she said finally. That girl did what she had to, and I won't ever be ashamed of her again. But she's not who I am anymore. She looked toward Ezra's grave, then toward Coil's, two men bound now forever by the same hard reckoning. I'm just Odessa. Same as I always meant to be, once I finally stopped hiding from it. Word of what Garner had intended for the San Carlos families reached them within days, carried by Amos, who felt he owed them the truth, plain and complete, the same way Odessa had finally learned to owe it to everyone else in her life. An elder from the settlement closest to the boundary, a woman named Talitha, who had known Ezra since he was a boy, small enough to ride in front of his father's saddle, rode out to the Marsh Place herself once the fighting was well behind them, bringing with her a woven basket of late-season corn and a silence that carried more weight than any speech could have. She stood in the yard a long while before she spoke, studying Odessa with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who had lived long enough to recognize grief wearing many different faces. Ezra chose well, she said finally. We wondered, some of us, in the early years. A stage line stranger, no family of her own to speak for her. She set the basket down on the porch step. We understand better now. I should have told all of you the truth sooner, Odessa said. About who I was, what I was hiding. Perhaps. Talitha's eyes held no judgment in them, only a patient, weathered kindness. But you kept us safe with your silence for years, and you kept us safe again with your truth this past week. Once the silence stops serving anyone, a person does what the moment asks of them. That is all any of us can do. She touched Odessa's hand once, briefly before she left, not quite an embrace, but something close enough to one that Odessa found herself blinking back tears, long after the older woman's horse had disappeared back over the ridge. Garrett Voss stayed on another week before he rode east again. His business with Coil, long since concluded in every sense that mattered, though something in the way he lingered at her gate, the morning he finally left, suggested his business with this particular stretch of Arizona was not entirely finished either. You'll be all right out here, he said. Not quite a question. I will. Marshall's got the paperwork clean now. Nobody's coming looking for the Cimarron ghost anymore, far as any record shows. He studied her a moment, something almost gentle in his weathered face. Reckon that means you get to just be a rancher's widow the rest of your days if that's what you want. I think, she said slowly. I'd rather be exactly who I am. Whatever that turns out to mean going forward. He nodded slow, considering that a long moment. Can I ask you something? He said. Before I go, you can that day on the coach. Dell. His eyes held hers, steady, honest. You ever wonder what would have happened if he'd run instead? She was quiet a long moment, looking past him toward the ridge, toward the road that had carried so much grief and reckoning toward her in the space of a single week. Every day, she said finally. For 8 years. I still don't have an answer that fixes anything, but I've stopped needing one to fix it. Some debts don't ever get closed clean, Mr. Voss. You just learn to carry them different. That's a hard way to live. It's the only honest way I know. He touched the brim of his hat at that, something like respect settling into the gesture that hadn't quite been there before. For what it's worth, he said, I don't chase ghosts anymore, not after this one. A man can only spend so many years hunting other people's grief before he starts wondering what he's running from himself. Where will you go? Haven't decided. He swung up into his saddle, easy, unhurried. Might come back through one of these years. See how the rancher's widow's getting along. You'd be welcome. He nodded once and rode off down the same road that had once carried 3 careless men toward her, and then a grieving hunter, and then, finally, whatever peace this whole hard reckoning had left behind in its wake. Word of everything that had happened out at the Marsh Place settled over the town slowly, the way truth settles when it finally arrives, after weeks of rumor, And it changed something in how the town regarded her, though not in any way Odessa had expected. She had braced herself for suspicion, for the particular wariness a small, close-knit place reserves for anyone whose secrets turn out to run deeper than anyone guessed. What she found instead, in the weeks that followed, was something closer to a quiet, practical kind of respect, the kind that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be felt. It showed up first in small ways. The mercantile owner knocking a little off her bill without being asked. The blacksmith riding out unprompted to reset a wagon wheel that had been giving her trouble since before the shooting, refusing payment when she offered it, saying only that a woman who'd stood the ground she'd stood deserved a neighbor who didn't wait to be asked for help. Then, on a clear Saturday 3 weeks after the burying, half a dozen wagons rolled up the Marsh Road unannounced, loaded with lumber and tools and more casseroles than one woman could reasonably eat in a month. And by the time the sun went down that evening, the fence line, the first 3 riders had ridden through, the stretch that had never quite been the Simpsons, stood straighter and sturdier than it had in years. Purdy Jessup was among them, working a post-hole digger with more energy than a man his age had any business showing, and when Odessa tried to thank him, he only waved her off with the particular gruffness of a man uncomfortable, being thanked for doing what he considered plain decency. Your daddy did right by this territory more than once, whether folks remember it proper or not, he said. Figured it was past time somebody did right by his girl. Amos worked alongside them the whole day, quieter than usual, watching the fence rise post by post with something in his face that Odessa recognized, because she carried the same thing herself, now the particular, hard-won relief of a person who has finally stopped grieving alone. By evening, with the last post set and the light going gold and long across the yard, someone struck up a fiddle, and for a few hours the Marsh Place held nothing but the ordinary, unremarkable sound of neighbors enjoying each other's company. The kind of evening the ranch had not seen since before Ezra died. Odessa stood at the edge of it for a while, watching, a plate of food going untouched in her hands, and found herself thinking of her father, who had never in his whole careful life had an evening quite like this one, because the shadow he carried had never once let him settle anywhere long enough to earn it. She had earned it. Finally, the hard way, same as everything else in her life had ever come to her. She thought, too, of Coil, one grave over from Ezra, now on the quiet rise behind the house, and wondered whether some version of this, an ordinary evening, a fiddle, neighbors, who no longer needed convincing, was the thing he had actually been chasing all those 8 long years, buried underneath the grief he'd mistaken for purpose. She hoped, wherever he was, that he had finally found something close to it. Later that same week, Marshal Bragg rode out one final time, not on official business, though he framed it that way out of habit, more than necessity. He found her repairing a section of the porch rail that had come loose in the fighting, and he sat his horse a while, watching her work before he finally spoke. Territorial office is closing the file, he said. Officially, anyhow. Coburn's awaiting trial. Dobbs is in federal custody, and there's a formal note in the record, now stating your husband's death was a wrongful killing, tied to a broader conspiracy, not misadventure like it was first written up. Thank you for seeing to that. Wasn't only me. He studied her a moment. You did the seeing to, ma'am. I just carried the paper. She set down her hammer. There's something else, he said, reaching into his coat. He produced a folded document, official-looking, a territorial seal pressed into the wax at its corner. Reward still on the books for the Cimarron ghost. $500, standing 8 years now. Never claimed because nobody could ever confirm who to pay it to. Her breath caught. I'm not looking to collect on myself, Marshal. Didn't figure you were. He held the paper out anyway. But given everything that's come to light, given the full account of what happened on that stage all those years back, and given that the last man alive with any claim against you chose to die protecting you instead of collecting on you himself, the territorial judge saw fit to close the bounty out permanent, marked satisfied. No further claim, from any party, for any reason, now or ever. He set the paper on the porch rail beside her hammer. Figured you'd want that in writing, he said. Some ghosts, once they're properly laid to rest, deserve the paperwork to prove it. He tipped his hat and rode off, and Odessa stood alone on her porch. For a long while afterward, the document in her hands, reading the words closed, satisfied. No further claim over and over until they finally settled somewhere, true inside her chest. Autumn came on slow that year, the way it always did in that country. The grass going gold and then gray, the nights carrying an edge that hadn't been there in summer, and life on the Marsh Place settled gradually into something Odessa had not felt in longer than she could clearly remember. Ordinary. Amos rode over most evenings now, sometimes to help with chores, more often just to sit on the porch and talk. The careful distance that had once stood between them worn away entirely by everything they'd survived together. He had started courting a young woman from town that fall, a school teacher named Ruth, who taught at the small clapboard schoolhouse and had a laugh Odessa found herself looking forward to whenever the two of them came out to visit, and watching him build something new out of a year that had nearly broken him gave Odessa a quiet, private kind of hope she hadn't expected grief to leave room for. One cold morning in late October, a girl from a neighboring homestead showed up at the marsh gate, 13 years old, thin and serious-faced, leading a mule that was clearly more stubborn than she was equipped to handle. "Are you her?" the girl asked. Without preamble, the particular bluntness of a child who has rehearsed a question too many times to soften it now. "The one who shot the men. The one they say learned it from her daddy." "I am. Will you teach me?" Odessa studied her a long moment. Saw something in the girl's face she recognized, without needing to be told the reason for it, the particular wariness of someone who had already learned, too young, that the world did not extend safety generously to a girl growing up alone on hard land. "Why do you want to learn?" she asked. The girl hesitated, then answered honest, the way children sometimes did, before they learned to guard their honesty the way adults did. "My pa's gone most months, working the mines. It's just me and my mama out there. And I got scared is all. After I heard what happened out here." Odessa thought of her own father, crouched beside her in Kansas dust, 20 years gone, adjusting her wrist an inch, maybe less, and telling her the difference between a killer and a survivor, before she was even old enough to understand why the difference mattered. She thought of the promise she'd made at his graveside, and the different, harder promise she'd made more recently, standing over a truth she'd spent a year avoiding. "All right," she said finally. "But I'll tell you the same thing my father told me, and I need you to hear it plain before we start. I'm not going to teach you to be a killer. I'm going to teach you to be a survivor. There's a difference, and it matters more than anything else I can show you." "What's the difference?" "A killer looks for reasons to draw," Odessa said. "A survivor prays every day she never has to, and trains anyway, because the day doesn't ask your permission before it arrives." The girl nodded slowly, the words settling into her, the way important words do when a person is young enough to still take them seriously. They started that same morning, with an old bottle set up on a fence post and a borrowed revolver too heavy for the girl's small hand. And Odessa found herself saying things she hadn't heard out loud in 20 years, her father's voice moving through her own mouth, as naturally as breathing. Elbow locked. Not stiff. Locked. "Tell me what you see." Watching the girl miss the bottle by a hand's width, then miss again by less, Odessa felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't expected grief and reckoning to leave room for either. Not peace, exactly. Something steadier than that. Purpose. Her father had trained her out of love and out of fear for what the world might do to her if he didn't. She understood now, watching a stranger's daughter square her stance against an autumn wind, that she had inherited more from him than a steady hand and a walnut-gripped revolver. She had inherited the particular responsibility of making sure the next person standing alone against a hard world had someone patient enough to make certain she survived it. The girl's mother came for her at dusk, apologetic, saying the girl had wandered off without asking permission, but softening considerably when she saw the two of them still out by the fence post, working through the same 20 shots Odessa had once fired as a child of 8. "She's got a good eye," Odessa told the woman. "Steady hands, too, for her age. If you're willing, I'd be glad to have her back." The woman studied Odessa a long moment, the way people in that territory had taken to studying her since the truth came out, careful and curious, and increasingly unmistakably respectful. "Everyone in town's got a story about you now," she said. "Didn't know which ones to believe." "Believe the parts about the shooting," Odessa said. "The rest of it's mine to tell, when I'm ready to tell it." The woman nodded, satisfied with that, and led her daughter home across land that had, over the course of one hard season, become a good deal safer for both of them than it had been before. Elias Coburn's trial convened in the territorial courthouse the following spring, and Odessa rode into town to testify, though the prosecutor assured her beforehand that the written record alone, combined with the confession of one of Coburn's surviving hands and Marshal Bragg's own eyewitness account of the man fleeing his own fight, would likely be more than sufficient without her. She testified anyway, sat straight-backed in the witness chair, and answered every question put to her in a voice that did not waver, because she had decided, somewhere in the months since the shooting, that she owed it to Ezra to say his name plainly in a room where the truth of what happened to him would finally be entered into the record for good. Coburn sat through the whole of it in his fine gray coat, considerably less fine now for the weeks it had spent in a territorial cell, and would not meet her eyes even once. The judge, an austere man named Whitcomb, who had presided over that district for the better part of 2 decades, took less than an hour to reach his verdict, once the evidence was fully laid before him. Conspiracy to commit murder, he read, his voice carrying flat and final through the packed courtroom. Attempted seizure of private land by force. Solicitation of armed men in the commission of a felony. He looked up from his papers, over the rim of his spectacles, directly at the man standing before him. This territory has tolerated a great deal from men of means, who believe their money bought them room to operate outside the law. It does not, and this court intends to make that plain with the sentence it hands down today. 20 years at hard labor in the territorial prison at Yuma. Coburn did not react beyond a slight tightening around his jaw, the last visible remnant of the pride that had once made him believe a woman alone on a quiet stretch of land would simply hand over what he wanted rather than fight for it. Odessa watched him led away in irons and felt, to her own mild surprise, no particular satisfaction in the sight. Only a kind of settled, quiet relief, the feeling of a ledger finally balanced after carrying an unpaid debt for longer than it should have gone uncounted. Outside the courthouse, Marshal Bragg fell into step beside her as she walked toward her horse. "You did right, testifying," he said. "Wasn't required of you. Ezra deserved it said out loud, not just written down." Bragg nodded, understanding that without needing further explanation, and the two of them walked the rest of the way to the hitching post, in the comfortable, unhurried silence of two people who had, over the course of one difficult season, come to trust each other's judgment without needing to test it constantly. "Territory's quieter now," he said as she mounted up. "Whether that's on account of you or just plain coincidence, I couldn't rightly say. But I've noticed it, all the same. Maybe it's just been due a little quiet. Maybe so." He touched the brim of his hat. "Safe ride home, ma'am." She rode the long road back toward the Marsh Place alone, past the courthouse and the mercantile and the saloon, where a story about her had once traveled faster than truth could keep pace with, and found herself thinking, as the town fell away behind her, and the open grassland took its place, that the road looked different to her now than it had a year before. Not because the land itself had changed, because she had finally stopped riding it like a woman with something to hide. Amos married Ruth the following autumn. A small ceremony held in the schoolhouse yard under a sky the same pale gold it had been the day Odessa first met Ezra at that trading post counter, and she stood as witness beside him with a happiness that surprised her by how uncomplicated it felt. There had been a time, in the raw months right after the fighting, when she had wondered whether Amos would ever fully set down the weight of that year, the suspicion, the grief, the guilt he carried over hoofprints he hadn't spoken up about soon enough. Watching him now, standing before the small gathering of neighbors with his hands steady and his eyes fixed on Ruth like she was the only sturdy thing left in a world that had shown him how quickly the ground could shift, Odessa understood that he had set it down after all. Not forgotten it. Simply stopped letting it decide what came next for him. "You look like you're about to cry," Ruth teased her gently, after the vows were said and the small crowd had scattered toward the tables of food laid out under the cottonwoods. "I might," Odessa admitted. "Your husband's the last piece of Ezra I've got left in this world. Seeing him happy feels like something Ezra would have wanted to see, too." Ruth's smile softened at that, and she squeezed Odessa's hand briefly, before the crowd pulled her back toward the celebration. Odessa found Amos alone for a moment, near the punch table, watching his new wife laugh with a cluster of her students, and she came to stand beside him without a word. "He'd be proud of you," she said finally, "for all of it. Not just today." Amos didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone rough in a way that had nothing to do with the dry autumn air. "Couldn't have gotten here without you pushing me toward the truth instead of letting me keep grieving something that was actually a lie," he said. "Figured I owed you the saying of that, even if it's a strange thing to say at a man's own wedding." "It's not strange," she said. "It's just honest. I've learned to prefer that kind of talk these days." He laughed, short and real, and for a moment the two of them simply stood together, watching the last of the light fall gold across a gathering that would have seemed, a year before, like something neither of their lives had room left for. She rode home alone that evening, under a sky gone deep violet at its edges, the first stars already showing, and found herself thinking that this, too, was a kind of promise kept. Not one her father had taught her in words, one she had learned instead by living long enough past the worst of it to watch someone she loved find his way back to joy. Garrett Voss made good on his word that same season, riding back through in early winter with considerably less dust on him than the last time she'd seen him, and a manner about him that suggested the intervening months had treated him kindly. He found her out by the fence line, working alongside the girl from the neighboring homestead, who had grown steadier with the revolver over the months, and was, by then, hitting the bottle more often than she missed it. "Looks like you've taken on a student," Voss said, dismounting easy. "Looks like you've taken on some peace," she answered. "Suits you?" He laughed at that, short and genuine, and stayed on through supper, trading stories with Amos and Ruth that had the whole table laughing by the meal's end. And when he finally rode out the next morning, he left behind a promise to return again. Come spring, one Odessa found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, looking forward to keeping him to. Some debts, she was learning, did not need to be grim to matter. Some could simply be the quiet, ongoing kind, paid out one visit at a time, one fence post at a time, one honest evening at a time, for as long as the people involved were willing to keep showing up for each other. That, too, felt like something worth calling a promise kept. Winter arrived early that year, dusting the ridge with the first thin snow the territory had seen in some seasons, and on a quiet evening in December, Odessa climbed the rise behind the house one more time, before the light failed completely. Two graves stood there now instead of one, a respectful distance apart, and she stood between them a long while, feeling the particular weight of everything that connected them. A stagecoach robbery she never chose, a promise her father raised her to keep, a debt 8 years unpaid that had finally, and at great cost, found its own strange resolution in the dust of her own yard. She thought of Amos, building a life of his own now, with a patience that reminded her more of Ezra every season that passed. She thought of Talitha's basket of corn, long since emptied and washed and returned, a small unspoken promise that the community she'd married into had not merely tolerated her all these years, but had genuinely, quietly welcomed her, secret and all, once the secret finally came to light. She thought of the girl at the fence post, learning to lock her elbow against the recoil, carrying forward a lesson that had outlived every man who'd ever taught it. She thought, last of all, of the girl in the old tintype photograph, tucked now into a drawer instead of a buried box, no longer something to fear discovery of. 19 years old, a shotgun cradled easy across her arms, an expression that had held no softness at all. That girl had never really disappeared. She had only been waiting, patient as ever, for the day she would be allowed to stand in the daylight again without shame attached to her name. That day had come and stayed, and Odessa had learned, in the months since, that daylight asked something different of a person than hiding ever had. Hiding only asked you to survive. Daylight asked you to keep living, plainly, in front of people who now knew exactly who you were and had decided, one fence post and one casserole and one basket of corn at a time, that the knowing didn't change what you were owed. She thought of her father's voice, 20 years gone now, still clear as a bell across all that distance. A gun is a promise, Odessa, not a threat, and a promise once you make it, you keep, even when it costs you everything. She had kept every promise she'd ever made, across a stagecoach and a marriage and a year of grief and a season that had finally, and at real cost, laid every hidden truth bare in the open air where it belonged. The debt was paid now, every side of it, in a currency that had asked far more of her than money ever could have. She thought, too, of all the versions of herself the years had asked her to be. The child in the Kansas dust, learning to lock her elbow against the recoil of a gun too heavy for her hand. The girl on the stagecoach boot, silent and watchful, earning a name she never chose and couldn't shake. The bride at a trading post counter, setting down a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. The widow at a clothesline, counting exits, without appearing to count anything at all. And now this a woman standing on her own rise, in her own falling snow, no longer needing to be any one of those selves at the exclusion of the others, because she finally understood that she had always, in some fashion, been all of them at once. Her father had never gotten to see this version of her. She liked to think, standing there in the cold with the snow, settling soft over two graves, that he would have recognized her anyway. Snow began to fall lightly across the rise, catching on the wooden markers, catching in her hair, and she stood a while longer between the two graves, unhurried, the way her father had taught her to be unhurried about anything that mattered. Then she turned back toward the house, toward the lamplight already glowing warm behind the window, toward a supper waiting and a ranch to run, and, come morning, a young girl who would show up at her gate, wanting to practice her aim against an old bottle on a fence post. Whatever came next, and something always came next. In a country like this one, Odessa Marsh intended to meet it the way her father had raised her to. Standing, steady, and, for the first time in a very long while, not alone in the carrying of it. Somewhere behind her in the barn, a horse settled for the night, undisturbed, unafraid, the way it had every night since the trouble that once rode down that ridge had finally fully run its course. She closed the door behind her against the cold and did not check the lock twice before she did. She did not need to anymore. The land held two graves and one living woman who had finally stopped hiding from either the grief or the grace of her own story, and beneath a sky already thick with the season's first true snowfall. That seemed, at long last, like enough. Come morning there would be chores waiting, same as always. A fire to build, a fence to check, a young girl likely, showing up at the gate before the frost had fully burned off the grass, eager for another lesson, with an old bottle and a borrowed gun. Ordinary work for an ordinary life, the kind she had once believed the past would never let her keep. She had been wrong about that too, in the best way a person could be wrong. And somewhere beneath all of it, quiet, now, no longer needing to hide, the girl in the tintype photograph stood in the daylight at last, watching the woman she had become tend a fire, mend a fence, and teach a stranger's daughter the difference between surviving and simply killing. It was, Odessa thought, exactly the kind of ending her father would have wanted for her. Not glory, not vengeance finished and forgotten, just a woman, still standing, still steady, still keeping every promise she had ever made, on land that had asked everything of her and had, in the end, given something lasting back in return. The snow kept falling, soft and unhurried, over the ranch, over the rise, over the whole quiet stretch of Arizona ground that had once been the site of the worst week of her life and had become, in the season since, simply home. Somewhere out past the ridge, the wind moved once through bare winter grass and settled, and the territory itself seemed to hold its breath a moment longer before letting the ordinary business of another evening carry on. Inside, the lamp burned steady in the window, and Odessa Marsh went to meet it.